Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The October wind carried with it the sickly sweet stench of rotting leaves mixed with something else. Something metallic and stale like old blood. It howled through the broken windows of the abandoned Riverside State Hospital that sprawled like a diseased skeleton across the hilltop. Just beyond the thick pine forest that bordered the small town of Millbrook. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the crumbling brick walls and shattered glass in deep crimson hues, making the already terrifying place look like a set from a horror movie. It seemed as if the very sky was bleeding over this scar on the Earth's surface. This was exactly where three 16-year-old teenagers were heading. At their age, the world still feels like a testing ground for courage, and forbidden places beckon with promises of adventure and secrets hidden in the darkness. Jake, are you sure this is a good idea? Emma pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around herself, the same jacket she'd found in a thrift store, and that had become her faithful companion on adventures like this. Her blonde hair whipped around in the wind, getting in her eyes, and her usually bright blue eyes were filled with undisguised worry. Maybe we should just go back. My grandmother always said people disappear around here. She says the place is cursed, that the spirits of the patients still roam the halls. Emma, come on, Tyler laughed, kicking a rusty beer can that went clanging into the thick undergrowth, startling a flock of crows. Tyler was Emma's complete opposite, stocky and short-haired, with an eternally mocking, almost defiant look in his dark brown eyes. He was always the ringleader in questionable adventures, the first to climb into abandoned buildings, and his energy often outweighed common sense. Those are just old wives' tales, probably just homeless people hanging out there, that's all. And who disappears. Some drunks who can't find their way home after too many beers. Jake walked slightly ahead, grimly looking down at his feet, as if trying to read in the cracks of the broken asphalt either a warning or permission to go further. He was something between cautious Emma and reckless Tyler. The idea to go to the hospital belonged to Tyler, of course. He had heard from older kids at school stories about treasures that could supposedly be found in the abandoned wards of the hospital that had been closed for over 20 years. Maybe old medical equipment worth money, or just some interesting junk. Emma went along because she was afraid to stay alone, and because, despite her fear, she didn't want to let her friends go by themselves. Jake went because he didn't want to seem like a coward in front of Tyler, who was always challenging him, and because somewhere deep inside, under layers of common sense and caution instilled by his parents, he was curious too. Something was drawing him to this cursed place, some unhealthy, painful spark of interest that he was afraid to explain even to himself. Come on, Em, Jake said reconcilingly, not turning around but slowing his pace slightly so his friends could catch up with him. We'll just take a look and head back, an hour at most. Nobody will even notice. We'll tell them at home that we were at my place playing video games. Just watch your step and don't go sticking your head into anything dangerous, especially you, Tyler. Me, I'm the picture of caution, Tyler snorted. but his eyes gleamed with excitement. They passed the tilted chain-link fence, with pathetic remnants of barbed wire hanging like rusty garlands, and found themselves on the grounds of the former hospital. The atmosphere changed instantly. The town noise was left behind, replaced by silence broken only by the howling wind and their own footsteps. The asphalt under their feet was cracked, littered with broken glass, brick chips, and some slippery trash. From the black openings of windows and doorways of empty wards came a grave chill, dust, and desolation. The air became even thicker, heavier. A mixture of smells from rotting organic matter, old machine oil, dampness, and some inexplicable, disturbing stench hit their nostrils so strongly that Emma winced again. Whoa, Tyler breathed with genuine delight, looking around. The ruins clearly impressed him. Now this is scale. You could really find something valuable here. Metal, for example. Dad said copper is expensive now. Yeah, or tetanus, Emma muttered, warily eyeing the rusty, sagging beams hanging overhead like the jaws of some prehistoric beast. Or some other infection. Let's just walk around and go home. No way, we just got here, Tyler protested. The most interesting stuff is inside. They moved deeper into the grounds, toward the place where the hospital buildings almost grew into the thick forest. Tall pine trees loomed in the distance, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. Among the scattered medical equipment and overturned gurneys, the skeletons of old ambulances could be seen, looking like giant dead insects half buried in fallen leaves and debris. The wind rustled the plastic bags caught in the fence, and it seemed as if the whole place was breathing, living its own disgusting life. Look, Tyler pointed to a half-destroyed 4-story building, standing slightly apart from the main wards, closer to the forest itself. It was built of brick that had darkened with time and architecturally resembled a former administrative building or laboratory. The windows were either broken out or boarded up with random junk. Part of the roof had collapsed, exposing blackened rafters, but the walls were still standing, giving the building the appearance of a grim, impregnable fortress. Let's go there. That's probably where the most interesting offices are. Maybe some documents are left, or equipment. Jake felt a new, stronger pang of anxiety. The building looked especially ominous against the backdrop of the sunset. The dark gaps of windows resembled empty eye sockets of a skull. The collapsed roof, the broken archway, it radiated not just abandonment, but some kind of ingrained, deep-seated sadness and threat. Tyler, maybe we shouldn't, he began uncertainly, stopping. It looks creepy as hell. Seriously, I have a bad feeling about this. Come on, Jake, not again, Tyler smirked, trying to hide his own nervousness behind false bravado. He too felt the oppressive atmosphere of this place, but admitting it was beyond his strength. Emma's braver than you today. We'll just take a quick look and head right back. Scout's honor. Emma remained silent, only clenched her fists tighter in her jacket pockets. She was scared, but even more scared of being left here alone or showing that she was the only one against it. Besides, the thought of finishing this expedition quickly made her nod. Fine, Jake exhaled, understanding that arguing was useless. But if something's wrong, we're out of here immediately. No discussion. Got it. Got it, Commander. Tyler grinned, and was the first to head toward the dark entrance to the building, stepping over piles of trash and debris. Jake and Emma exchanged anxious glances and followed him, plunging into the shadow of the ominous structure. A premonition of trouble squeezed their hearts with cold fingers. Inside the building reigned twilight and absolute ruin. The air was stale, heavy, filled with the smell of mold, dampness, rat droppings, and all the same incomprehensible, disturbing organic stench that here became almost unbearable, eating into the mucous membranes of the nose. The floor was littered with a thick layer of debris, plaster, broken brick, rotting papers that had turned into brown dust, and glass shards that crunched underfoot with every step. Thick dust hung in the air, dancing in the slanted rays of the setting sun, breaking through holes in the walls, and sealing like ghostly spotlights on a stage of desolation. Gross, Emma wrinkled her nose, covering her nose and mouth with her jacket sleeve. What stinks so bad here? Dead rats, garbage, who knows what else? Tyler waved it off, though he didn't look too confident himself. He shone his phone's flashlight into one of the rooms opening onto the corridor. Looks like this used to be some kind of office. There's a broken desk lying there, a cabinet tipped over. Nothing interesting. They carefully made their way down the main corridor that went deep into the building. The beams of their phone flashlights picked out of the darkness peeling walls with illegible graffiti and mold stains. Rusty pipes hanging from the ceiling. Scraps of wires looking like gallows for invisible creatures. The silence pressed on their ears, hollow, dead, broken only by their own footsteps, the crunch of debris underfoot, and the distant howling of wind outside, which sounded especially mournful and ominous here inside. Suddenly Jake stopped abruptly, raising his hand. "Quiet, do you hear that?" Tyler and Emma also froze, tensely listening. Through the howl of wind and the beating of their own hearts came a strange sound, quiet, intermittent, but distinct. It was like a shuffling, as if someone was dragging a bag of something granular across the floor. Then something else was added, wet, squelching, slapping. The sound came from somewhere deep in the corridor, from the impenetrable darkness ahead. "What is that?" Emma whispered. Her eyes widened with fear, her voice cracked. "Rats, probably," Tyler suggested uncertainly, but nervously looked around. His hand gripped his phone tighter. Huge ones, garbage rats, mutants the size of cats. The sound repeated, now slightly louder, definitely closer. Shuffling, light scraping, then again that disgusting wet slapping. It was somehow wrong, rhythmic yet chaotic at the same time, not like sounds that rats or wind playing with scraps of roofing could make. There was something alive in this sound, but completely alien. "Let's get out of here," Jake said firmly, feeling an icy chill run down his spine. His survival instinct screamed danger. "I don't like this at all." "Come on, Jake, we almost reached the end of the corridor." "Maybe there's," Tyler began, trying to preserve the remnants of his courage, but stopped short. From the darkness of the doorway at the end of the corridor came a new sound, quiet but distinct, scraping, as if something hard and sharp was scratching the concrete floor. Then again the shuffling, multiple small touches, and that disgusting rhythmic slapping. It was approaching. "That's it, we're out of here," Tyler commanded. His bravado evaporated without a trace, replaced by poorly concealed panic. They turned sharply and rushed back toward the exit, toward the saving light of dusk. But they hadn't taken more than a few steps when ahead, in the direction they had come from, there was a deafening crash. Something heavy, a beam or part of the ceiling, had collapsed, blocking the corridor. A wall of dust, concrete, and rusty metal rose, and such a cloud of dust rose that for a moment it became impossible to breathe. "Shit," Jake swore, coughing and waving away the dust. "Cave in, there's no way back." They were trapped. The way back was cut off by a wall of debris. The only road was forward, into the darkness from which those terrible sounds were inexorably approaching. "There," Emma whispered, pointing with a trembling finger into the darkness of the corridor they had just fled from. "It's there. It's coming here." The sounds were approaching with frightening speed. The shuffling became louder, more insistent, as if hundreds of fingers were scratching across the floor. The slapping turned into measured, rhythmic slaps, as if dozens of wet palms were clapping against concrete. Added to this was a quiet but distinct clicking sound, like the knocking of bones against each other, dry joints. Fear gripped their throats with icy clamps, paralyzing their will. Jake frantically found the flashlight button on his phone and directed the trembling beam into the darkness of the corridor. What they saw in the nervous light of the flashlight made their blood freeze in their veins and a scream of horror stick in their throats. From the gloom, slowly but inevitably, rolling and trembling on multiple limbs, was crawling out it. It had neither head nor torso in the usual sense of these words. It was a nightmarish, grotesque, constantly crackling sculpture assembled from dozens, if not hundreds, of human arms and legs. The limbs were the most diverse: long, short, thin and fat, pale, almost bluish, swarthy, dark brown, male, female, even children's. Some looked relatively fresh, with remnants of clothing on wrists or ankles. Others were dried, mummified, covered with stains of rot, mold, and dried dirt. They stuck out at unimaginable, unnatural angles, intertwining and growing together with each other. In places, they were connected by dark, shiny, fibrous veins resembling tarred ropes or giant tendons. Pieces of rusty rebar, scraps of barbed wire, steel cables that had grown eaten into the dead flesh and bones, binding this nightmare together, were roughly woven into this terrible construction. The creature moved by leaning on multiple palms and feet spread in all directions. It moved unevenly, in jerks, swaying from side to side like a giant disgusting spider or centipede from the fevered dream of a madman. Each of its steps was accompanied by the rustling of many fingers on debris, wet slapping of rotting flesh, and quiet bone clicking of joints. The center of mass of this nightmarish pile constantly shifted, making the movement unpredictable and even more terrifying. "What the hell is this thing?" Tyler whispered, slowly backing away and pressing his back against the cold, rough wall of the corridor. His face was white as paper, eyes bulging from their sockets. Emma quietly sobbed, the sound coming out muffled, like the squeak of a trapped animal. She covered her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming at the top of her lungs. Jake stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away from this spawn of sick fantasy or hell itself. His brain refused to believe in the reality of what was happening. This couldn't be. This simply couldn't exist in the normal world. But it was here, in this abandoned building on the edge of the forest. It moved, rustled, slapped, inexorably closing the distance between itself and them. The collector flashed through Jake's mind, a word that came from nowhere, but it perfectly suited this creature. It was as if it collected itself from remains, from discarded parts, from lost fragments of life, creating a monstrous moving mosaic of alien flesh and pain. The creature stopped about 15 feet from them. Several hands, one thin, female, with a broken nail covered with pearlescent polish, another strong male with an anchor tattoo on the forearm. A third small child's slowly rose. Fingers began to move, feeling the air. It seemed to be listening, sniffing, determining their position. It had no eyes, ears, nose, but Jake felt its invisible, all-consuming, predatory attention on himself. It knew they were here. It knew they were potential material. Quiet, Jake whispered with his lips alone, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Don't move. Maybe it can't see. But it was too late. Emma, unable to bear the monstrous tension and the sight of moving dead fingers, sobbed again, this time louder, more convulsively. The sound lashed across their taut nerves. The collector's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The entire mass of limbs came into furious motion. Dozens of hands shot up and forward, turning the creature into a chaotic, stabbing ball of flesh and bone. It lunged at them with completely unexpected, impossible speed for such a construction, sliding across the concrete floor on multiple palms and feet. The shuffling and slapping gave way to loud scraping of claws on concrete and clicking of colliding bones. "Run," Tyler yelled, being the first to snap out of his stupor and push off from the wall. They dashed to the side, into the nearest doorway without a door that led to one of the side rooms. Jake managed to notice out of the corner of his eye how several of the collector's hands struck the place where they had just been standing with such force that deep scratches and dents remained in the concrete wall. They found themselves in a small room littered with overturned metal shelves, broken laboratory glass, some rusted equipment. The door had been knocked out, only a crooked frame remained. The collector was already turning in the corridor, its limbs feeling the walls, trying to determine their location, making rustling and scraping sounds. "Over here, quick!" Jake pulled Emma by the hand toward the opposite wall, where an uneven hole gaped in the brick masonry, leading apparently to the next room or corridor. The opening was probably made by looters, or it formed naturally over time. Tyler was already squeezing through this saving breach. Emma, stumbling, followed him. Jake jumped in last, and at that very moment one of the collector's hands, long, bony, with unnaturally twisted fingers, struck the wall near the opening with force, showering him with a rain of brick chips and plaster. Another second and this hand would have grabbed him. They found themselves in another corridor, just as dark, damp, and cluttered. Behind them in the opening could be heard loud cracking and scraping. The collector was unceremoniously breaking down the brick masonry, trying to squeeze through after them. Its persistence was frightening. "It's climbing through. It's following us," Tyler shouted, looking back in horror. "Let's go, but where?" Jake frantically looked around, shining his flashlight. The corridor went in both directions, lost in darkness. But at one end, through the murky veil of dust, a weak rectangle of gray light was visible, possibly a window or opening in the outer wall. A chance for salvation. There toward the light. "Run," he shouted, and they ran again, not looking where they were going, jumping over trash and debris. Behind them came the roar and crack of breaking structures. The collector was breaking through after them, destroying everything in its path. Its movement was not just fast. It was somehow unnaturally smooth, and at the same time jerky, like a poorly animated nightmare. It could move along walls and ceiling with the same ease as along the floor, clinging with dozens of fingers to any unevenness, using shadows and rubble as cover. They ran out into a huge room with high ceilings. Part of the roof here had collapsed, and through the giant hole poured dim evening light mixed with distant orange reflections of city lights. This light was enough to see the scale of the destruction. In the middle of the room loomed the remains of some giant equipment, machines covered with a thick layer of rust and bird droppings, resembling skeletons of extinct monsters. "Where's the exit? We're lost," Emma panicked, pressing against Jake and looking around with an expression of pure horror on her face. "I don't know. Look for any door opening," Jake replied, breathing heavily. His heart was pounding somewhere in his throat, echoing with hollow beats in his ears. His lungs were burning. At that moment, from the dark corridor they had just run from, the collector appeared. In the huge space of the room, it looked even more monstrous. It moved faster than Jake expected, as if the open space gave it confidence. Several hands were already feeling the wall near the opening, finding support for a lunge. "Spread out," Tyler shouted, showing unexpected composure in panic. "That way it'll be harder for it to get all of us." He rushed in one direction, behind rows of old machines. Emma, understanding his plan, dashed the other way, hiding behind a large pile of rusty scrap metal. Jake froze for one terrible moment, choosing a direction, then threw himself toward the far wall of the room, where he saw another dark doorway, partially blocked with some rags and boards. The collector spilled into the center of the room. It stopped, slowly turning in place like a giant, disgusting radar. Dozens of hands felt the air, floor, walls. It had clearly lost direct sight of them and was now trying to determine their location by sound or movement. Tense silence reigned. Only the wind hummed in the roof holes. Water dripped monotonously somewhere in a dark corner of the room, counting the seconds of their possible life. Jake held his breath, pressing against the cold concrete wall behind a pile of trash. He could see Tyler carefully peeking out from behind his machine. His face was distorted with fear, but he was clearly trying to assess the situation. Emma was quietly crying behind her pile of scrap, her shoulders shaking. And then Tyler made a fatal mistake. He jerked back too sharply, scared by some rustling, and hit with his foot a piece of thick sheet metal lying on the floor. A sharp, ear-cutting clang rolled through the huge room, breaking the fragile silence. The collector instantly turned its entire body toward the sound. Its whole mass came into motion, and it rushed toward the machines where Tyler was hiding with frightening purposefulness. Its attack was like an explosion, chaotic and swift. Dozens of hands crashed down on the old machine, crushing the rusty metal like foil, trying to get to the victim hiding behind it. "Tyler," Jake screamed in horror, understanding that something irreparable was about to happen. Tyler jumped out from the other side of the machine and ran toward the opposite wall, trying to hide behind other equipment. But the collector was faster. Several long, flexible hands shot forward like living whips. One of them, thick, bluish, with short-cropped nails, wrapped around Tyler's leg just above the ankle. "No," Tyler screamed with a wild, terror-filled voice, falling on the dusty concrete floor. The hand, with incredible, inhuman strength, began to drag him toward the main mass of the creature. Tyler desperately clawed at the floor, at protrusions, tried to brace himself with his feet, but he was inexorably pulled toward the nightmarish pile of writhing limbs. Other hands were already reaching for him, writhing like snakes, trying to grab his clothes, body, hair. "No, let go, get off, you freak," Tyler yelled, trying to break free, hammering with his fists on the hand holding his leg, but to no avail. Jake watched this with eyes wide with horror. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand and watch his friend being torn apart. But what could he do against this mountain of living carrion? He was unarmed, weak, and the creature looked absolutely invulnerable to an ordinary human. Emma screamed in horror and grief, seeing what was happening to Tyler. Her scream was full of such hopelessness that Jake felt pain in his chest. The collector had almost pulled Tyler to itself. Several more hands gripped his body, pressing him to the moving, squelching mass. Tyler fought in their grip, screamed, but his strength was clearly running out. He was almost swallowed by the nightmare. Jake desperately looked around. His gaze frantically darted around the room and fell on a piece of thick, rusty rebar sticking out of a large concrete fragment nearby. Without thinking for a second, spurred by adrenaline and fear for his friend, he ran over, grabbed the cold metal with both hands, and with incredible effort that he wouldn't have been capable of in a normal situation, pulled the heavy rusty rod about 3 feet long from its concrete prison. "Hey, you bastard," Jake yelled, raising the rebar like a spear. His voice cracked, but he attracted attention. "Come here, come on, let him go." He rushed at the collector. Fear mixed with rage and desperation, creating an explosive mixture in his soul. He swung, and with all his strength, putting all his weight and all his hatred into the blow, struck the rebar against one of the hands holding Tyler by the torso. There was a disgusting wet crunch of breaking bone and tearing flesh. The hand jerked, unclenched, hanging like a whip. The collector reacted instantly. Several limbs closest to Jake shot toward him with incredible speed. He instinctively jumped back, barely dodging bony fingers that scratched the air right in front of his face. "Emma, run, help Tyler get him out," Jake shouted, trying to distract the monster's attention to himself, waving the rebar in front of him. He struck again with the rod, this time at a cluster of hands in the center of the creature's mass. The rebar went into something soft, yielding, causing a wave of convulsive movements throughout the monster's body. The creature jerked, and several limbs broke free from the general pile, flailing chaotically in the air. It made a sound, a low, vibrating, moaning roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and from which the hair on his head stood on end. Emma finally overcame her paralyzing stupor, ran to Tyler, who was still lying on the floor, and tried to drag him away from the monster. The hand that had held his leg was still not letting go, but its grip seemed weakened after Jake's blow. "Pull, help," Tyler groaned, trying to crawl away, wincing from the pain in his leg. Jake continued to fight off the hands attacking him, desperately swinging the rebar. He understood that he couldn't hold out like this for long. The creature was too strong, too fast, too big. His blows only briefly slowed and angered the monster, but didn't cause it serious harm. One of the hands moving from the side lashed him across the shoulder with such force that he lost his balance and crashed to the floor. The rebar rang as it flew aside. Jake fell on his back, hitting his head hard on the concrete. Colored circles swam before his eyes for a moment. Before he could come to his senses, he saw a nightmarish mass of limbs looming over him. Dozens of crooked fingers reached for him to grab, tear, drag away. "It's over," flashed through his mind with terrifying clarity. But then Emma, who had managed to drag Tyler aside a bit, showed unexpected courage. She grabbed some heavy metal fragment from the floor part of a machine, and with a desperate scream hurled it at the collector. The fragment hit the monster somewhere in the center of its mass. This gave Jake a precious chance. He rolled sharply to the side, jumped to his feet, and rushed to his rebar. Grabbing it tighter, he again threw himself at the monster, covering Emma and Tyler. "Get out of here, get lost, die, you freak," he yelled, delivering blow after blow to the chaotically moving mass. He no longer aimed, putting all his fear, all his rage, all his desperation into each strike. He hit hands, legs, places of their terrible interweaving, rusty wire and dark, shiny veins. The collector began to slowly retreat under this hail of blows. Its movements became more chaotic, jerky, uncertain. It seemed to be experiencing pain, or at least was disoriented by the unexpected and fierce resistance. The hand holding Tyler's leg finally unclenched, and Tyler was able to crawl further away. "Jake, over here, quick!" Tyler shouted with his last strength, pointing to that same doorway in the far wall that Jake had noticed earlier. "The exit, I think. I can see the street." Jake slowly backed toward his friends, not taking his eyes off the collector and keeping the rebar at the ready. The monster stopped a few yards from them. Its limbs slowly moved, some hands hung limply. Dark, thick liquid dripped from them. It seemed to be assessing the situation, deciding whether it was worth continuing the pursuit. Several fresh scratches and deep dents were visible on its disgusting body. A sharp metal fragment thrown by Emma stuck out of one wound. "Quick, let's go," Jake commanded in a whisper. Squeezing through the blocked opening, they found themselves outside, on the other side of the building. Evening twilight had almost turned to night, hiding the landscape details in gray haze. But ahead, beyond a strip of tall grass and the remains of a fence, the distant lights of the town were visible. Freedom was so close. Without stopping for a second, overcoming pain and fatigue, they ran away from the cursed place, from the hospital and forest. Tyler limped heavily. Each step came with difficulty. Emma supported him, barely moving her legs herself. Jake kept looking back, his heart stopping with fear of seeing the collector catching up with them in the darkness. But no one was chasing them. The abandoned hospital and the gloomy forest silently saw them off with their dark, threatening silhouettes, like giant beasts lurking in the gloom. They ran until they were out of breath, until their lungs began to burn with fire, and their legs turned to jelly. They stopped only when the sounds and smells of the hospital were left far behind, dissolved in the night air, and ahead loomed the first saving lights of houses on the town's outskirts. They stood at the edge of a field overgrown with tall, dry grass, breathing heavily, bent over, looking at each other with wide, horror-filled eyes. Dirty, scratched in torn clothes, scared to death. Tyler heavily sank right onto the dusty ground, grabbing his injured leg. On his jeans, in the place where the collector's hand had grabbed him, a large stain darkened, either dirt or blood mixed with something else vile and sticky. The skin under the fabric was scraped and bleeding. Emma trembled all over. Her tears, large and heavy, which she couldn't stop, flowed silently down her dirty cheeks, leaving light tracks. She hugged herself, trying to warm up or just hold herself together from falling apart. Jake dropped the heavy rebar that had still been in his hand. The metal thudded dully on the ground. His hands shook so hard he could barely clench his fists. His nails dug into his palms. "What was that?" Tyler finally squeezed out. His voice was hoarse and trembling. He looked at his leg with an expression of disgust and fear. I don't know, Jake replied, staring with unseeing eyes toward the hospital, which now seemed just a black, shapeless spot on the horizon. But it was collecting. It was made of them. He didn't finish the sentence. The image of the nightmarish creature, the living sculpture woven from others' limbs, again rose before his eyes with terrifying clarity. The collector. He remembered the hand with pearlescent polish, the hand with the tattoo, and the child's hand. Whose were they? Those missing people Emma's grandmother talked about. How many of them were there? We won't tell anyone, Emma said firmly, suddenly stopping crying and wiping tears with her dirty sleeve. Her voice sounded muffled but determined. Not a single word. No one will believe us. They'll think we got high or went crazy, or they'll blame us for something. People disappeared there. Maybe they'll think it was us. Jake slowly nodded. She was absolutely right. To tell about this meant not only to face disbelief and ridicule, but possibly police suspicion. They were at a crime scene or at the dwelling place of a monster. How to explain this? This nightmare should remain only between them, their terrible shared secret. Yeah, we keep quiet, Tyler agreed, rising from the ground with Jake's help. He winced from the pain in his leg. I swear, nobody gets a word. Let's go home, Jake said. His voice was alien, lifeless. We need to treat Tyler's leg and just get out of here. They slowly trudged toward town, instinctively trying to stay close to each other, as if their small group could protect them from the horror that remained behind. The silence between them was heavy, oppressive, filled with unspoken words and fragments of nightmarish memories. The world around them seemed unreal, alien. Windows of houses glowed, rare cars drove by. A dog barked lazily somewhere in the distance, ordinary evening life of the town. But for the three of them, this ordinariness was shattered to pieces. They had glimpsed beyond the edge, into the dark, rotting corner of the world, where something unimaginable dwells, assembled from decay, pain, and fragments of human bodies. Jake walked and felt how the icy touch of fear had settled deep inside, taken root in his very soul. He kept replaying in his head the moment when the collector retreated. It didn't look finally defeated or mortally wounded, rather distracted or deciding they were no longer of interest as prey. Or maybe it had achieved some goal of its own. Or maybe it was just waiting for them to come too close again. He looked at his hands, then at Emma's and Tyler's hands. Ordinary hands, whole, his own, for now whole. The thought that a piece of you, your hand, your leg, your skin, could become part of that moving nightmare made him shudder with nauseating horror. This was fear not just of death, but fear of dismemberment, loss of wholeness, transformation into a faceless fragment of a monster. They reached the first apartment buildings of the residential area. Tyler lived closest. Emma, despite her own trembling, walked him to his very entrance. Jake saw Tyler heavily climbing the steps, almost dragging his injured leg. Emma stood for a while, watching him go, then turned to Jake. "How are you?" she asked quietly. In the light of the street lamp, her face seemed exhausted and pale. "Fine," Jake lied. "And you?" "I'll survive." She smiled weakly, but the smile came out crooked. "See you tomorrow." "Yeah, at school. Take care, Em." She nodded and quickly walked toward her house, without looking back. Jake was left alone. He stood for a minute watching her go, then slowly wandered his own way, immersed in viscous, gloomy thoughts. When he got to his apartment on the 4th floor, he locked the door behind him with all the locks. which seemed completely insufficient to him. He stood under a hot shower for a long time, almost scalding himself, trying to wash off not only the dirt and stench of the hospital, but also the sticky feeling of experienced horror, the sensation of someone else's dead touch. But the images of the nightmarish encounter haunted him, flashing before his eyes. Writhing hands, wet slapping, empty window sockets of the abandoned hospital. Tyler's face distorted with horror, shuffling, slapping, scraping of bones. The following days turned into torture. At school, he, Tyler, and Emma tried to stick together, but almost didn't talk. The shared horror didn't bring them closer, but seemed to erect an invisible wall. Each experienced the nightmare alone. Tyler noticeably limped. To questions from classmates and teachers, he brushed them off, saying he fell off his bike. In his eyes had frozen a new, unfamiliar expression, a mixture of fear and some kind of grim determination. Emma became quiet, withdrawn. She often flinched at sharp sounds. Her gaze wandered as if she was constantly looking for something or afraid to see something. Jake plunged into paranoia. Every rustle behind the door made his heart skip a beat. Returning home in the evening, he looked around at every corner, peering into shadows and doorways. It began to seem to him that he was being followed. A couple of times out of the corner of his eye, he noticed some movement in the darkness of an alley, or a strange silhouette on the roof of a neighboring house. But when he looked directly, there was nothing there. Tricks of imagination. Or so he thought. One morning, leaving his apartment building, he stepped on something hard and small on the doormat. Bending down, he picked up the find. It was a darkened, yellowed human fingernail. Large, strong male. It wasn't like his nails or those of anyone in his family. It just lay there, on the doormat of the 4th floor of an ordinary apartment building. How did it get there? Jake stared at the disgusting find, and icy horror gripped him. He remembered the nightmare, Tyler's hand, Emma's hand. The collector was showing him parts of his friends, and now it had left him a gift, a sign, a warning. He didn't know, but one thing he understood for certain. The collector knew where he lived. The nightmare was much closer than he thought, and it wasn't going to retreat. The next few weeks passed in constant tension. Jake barely slept, starting at every sound. He installed additional locks on his door, hung heavy curtains on all windows, and kept a baseball bat by his bed. But deep down he knew that ordinary locks and bats wouldn't help against something like the collector. Emma called him one evening, her voice shaking. "Jake, I think it's watching my house. I saw something moving in the backyard, something that didn't look right, too many limbs. Did you tell your parents? What am I supposed to tell them? That a monster made of dead people is stalking us. They'll think I've lost my mind." Tyler had stopped going to school altogether. When Jake went to check on him, Tyler's mother said he was sick, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes too. Through Tyler's bedroom window, Jake glimpsed his friend sitting on his bed, staring at the wall with empty eyes, his injured leg wrapped in fresh bandages. The town began to whisper about more disappearances. First, it was old Mr. Henderson, who lived alone near the forest. Then the Petersons' teenage daughter vanished on her way home from a friend's house. The police found her backpack near the old hospital grounds, but no trace of her. Jake knew. He knew exactly what had happened to them. The collector was growing. One night, Jake woke to the sound of scratching at his window. Soft, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails on glass. His blood turned to ice. He lived on the fourth floor. Nothing should be able to reach his window. Slowly trembling, he crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A pale hand was pressed against the glass, then another, and another. They moved across the window surface, feeling, searching. In the darkness beyond, Jake could make out a writhing mass of limbs clinging to the side of the building. The collector had found him. The scratching stopped. The hands pulled away from the window. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a soft tapping at his front door. Gentle, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. Jake grabbed his phone and called Emma. "It's here," he whispered into the phone. "It's at my door." "Mine too," Emma's terrified voice came through the speaker. "Oh God, Jake, it's at my window. What do we do?" The tapping at Jake's door grew more insistent. Then he heard it, the familiar wet slapping sound, the shuffling of multiple limbs. It was moving around his apartment, circling like a predator. "Tyler," Jake said suddenly, "we have to get to Tyler. If it's hunting us, he's alone." They met at the bottom of Jake's building, both pale and shaking. The streets were empty, eerily quiet. As they ran toward Tyler's house, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, guided like sheep toward a slaughter. Tyler's house was dark, too dark. The front door hung open, moving gently in the night breeze. "Tyler," Emma called out, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. They found him in his bedroom, or what was left of him. Tyler sat propped against his bed, but his arms were gone. Clean cuts at the shoulders, as if they'd been surgically removed. His legs, too, had been taken. He was still alive, somehow, his eyes wide with terror and pain, his mouth moving soundlessly. On the floor beside him lay a note, written in Tyler's own handwriting, but clearly forced. "I gave them willingly. It doesn't hurt if you don't fight." Emma screamed. From somewhere in the house came the familiar shuffling sound, getting closer. "Run," Tyler mouthed silently to them. "Run." Jake grabbed Emma's hand and they fled into the night, the sound of the collector's pursuit echoing behind them. But there was nowhere to go. The creature had marked them, claimed them. It had taken Tyler piece by piece, and now it would come for them. As they ran through the empty streets, Jake realized the horrible truth. The collector didn't just hunt randomly. It was patient, methodical. It studied its prey, learned their habits, their fears. It had been planning this from the moment they first encountered it. They were never escaping. They were just prolonging the inevitable. The last thing Jake remembered was Emma's hand slipping from his, as something cold and dead wrapped around his ankle, pulling him down into the darkness. When he woke up, he was back in the hospital, in a room he didn't recognize. His arms and legs were still attached, but he could feel restraints binding him to a metal table. In the shadows around him, he could see other tables, other victims in various states of disassembly. The collector stood in the center of the room, its mass of limbs swaying gently. As Jake watched in horror, he realized some of those limbs looked familiar. Tyler's strong arms with their anchor tattoo. Emma's delicate hands with the chipped nail polish. And soon Jake understood. His own limbs would join the collection. The creature approached slowly, almost gently. Several hands reached out to touch his face, his arms, his legs, as if appraising their quality. Jake tried to scream, but no sound came out. He could only watch as the collector selected its tools, preparing to add him to its grotesque form, piece by piece, until nothing of Jake remained except another set of limbs in its endless, hungry collection. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was his own hand, severed and twitching, being carefully grafted onto the creature's writhing mass. The collector had completed its hunt. In the town of Millbrook, 3 more teenagers were added to the list of the missing. The old hospital was eventually demolished, but by then it was too late. The collector had moved on, finding new hunting grounds, new victims to add to its ever-growing collection of human parts. And somewhere in the darkness, it continues to hunt, continues to collect, continues to grow. Because some nightmares never end. They only find new victims. The authors of this story are Marcus Thompson. I don't understand who threatens you, what he or she looks like. I don't know. He has no face, just a gaping hole instead. Neither human nor beast, something else. Something we cannot see or hear. It kills everyone in its path without discrimination or mercy. But I found a way to capture it. You just need to. You need to undergo psychiatric and drug testing. The police officer shook his head. Please sign, I'll sign everything. I'll take all the tests, I babbled, gripping the pen with trembling hands. I'm begging you, help me. Lock me behind bars, isolate me from people, provide security. I just want to live. Finding the right location for a photo shoot is the most difficult part of a photographer's job. The right angle, proper lighting, the perfect model. None of this matters if there's nowhere to shoot. But this time, I found that golden spot anyone could wish for. If only I had known it would become a grave for all hope and human life. Jessica and I had been working together for several years. We met back in college. We're in different majors of the same faculty. You could say we started our professional careers in sync. I got a model, she got a personal photographer. It all started with shots in everyday clothes against sunsets. And now, 4 years later, my friend was already earning decent profit from advertising and sponsors, while I got my commission. Ghost of the Past, that's what our last photo shoot was called. A girl in snow-white outfits in an abandoned village. Lots of empty buildings. Jessica and I had explored together, had shoots at various factories, residential complexes, dormitories. But this was the first time we found the perfect location for our concept. The girl put on a snow-white dress that flowed freely even in the slightest breeze. The semi-transparent texture let light through beautifully, creating a magnificent ghostly effect. We were also incredibly lucky with the weather. There wasn't a single cloud in the sky. The sun perfectly illuminated the area, so we didn't need any lamps or even photo processing. No road signs remained. Only by asking residents of neighboring villages could we find this nameless settlement. I discovered it on satellite images, but even there it wasn't marked in any way. At first I thought it was some military facility, but it turned out this settlement was simply abandoned. "Why do you need to go there?" asked an old woman from a house on the village outskirts. "We have a photo shoot, we're filming," I answered honestly. "And tell me, how long has it been empty?" "They abandoned it probably back in Stalin's time," she waved her hand. "I was still a young girl when no one was left there. Many tried to settle there, but no one stayed long. During the Soviet era, they tried to make a collective farm. It didn't work out. In the 90s, some people moved there, but then disappeared too. The last time, about 15 years ago, the last planes from there also vanished." Vanished? I raised my eyebrows in confusion. "That land is cursed. The old woman said all this with a completely calm expression. For a second I thought she was joking, but then I realized she wasn't. Her deep-set eyes expressed some barely noticeable melancholy. Wrinkles framed inflamed eyelids. Her face had turned into a terrifying mask, hiding what was once a beautiful girl. Old age spares no one. The woman talked about the curse with complete seriousness. Her lips didn't twist into a smile for even half a second. On the contrary, with each word she sank deeper into dense melancholy. Something must have personally connected her to this abandoned village. What kind of curse? I asked carefully. It has haunted this place for a long time. They say the Scythians once surrounded this place with their burial mounds, so the dead would protect them from the curse of what sleeps in this earth. Later, a church was built there, but it burned down. Later, new settlers erected a mosque, but it literally collapsed underground. I don't know what's true and what's fiction, but the place is truly cursed. The wheels of my old sedan somehow overcame the bumps of the dirt road. Tall grass rose a meter high, and trained bushes and large stones were encountered in clearings. The steppe had already finished blooming at this time, but its scent still hung in the air, penetrating the car's cabin even through raised windows. We moved slowly so as not to puncture a tire or hit some boulder. While I concentrated on driving, Jessica sat next to me, already preparing for the photo shoot. She took all the necessary cosmetics from her bag to put on makeup as soon as we found a suitable place for shooting. In 30-degree heat, makeup doesn't last long, so you always need to act quickly and precisely. Do you think the old lady is sick or just decided to make fun of us? Asked the girl, unscrewing the cap from her lipstick. I think she just retold what she once heard, I replied without taking my eyes off the road. Often old people lack communication so much that they're ready to talk about anything with the first person they meet, even if they have to consciously tell them nonsense. Or unconsciously, brains often malfunction with age. And it seems to me her head is fine, but you're talking as if you wanted to laugh at her. No, I'm serious. Just think, we're going to an abandoned village that's not even on the map, only visible on satellite images on the internet. A long unused road leads to it, and a resident of a neighboring village tells us this place is cursed. Aren't there too many coincidences? And what's the probability that I'm actually taking you to your death? I said quietly, turning to face her. What are you talking about? She frowned. We're going somewhere you haven't even seen that village I found on satellite maps. What if it's simply not there? The old woman has completely lost her mind, and I gave her money to tell you all sorts of nonsense. And in the end, we'll stop in the middle of nowhere. I'll axe you, and that's it. No one will find Jessica Williams' body. After a second of deathly silence, we burst into laughter. That's what bonded me with my friend, this dark sense of humor, and the desire to thoroughly tease each other on any occasion. We didn't talk about anything else for the rest of the journey, each just focused on their own business. Finally, behind another hill, I saw what we were looking for. Gray walls scattered across the steppe. The houses seemed to have grown from the soil themselves. They seemed like a natural part of the landscape, as if no one had built them, but they had appeared here on their own. The village was located in a hollow. I looked at it from a hill. There were no more than 20 houses here, 10 buildings clustered in the center of the settlement, while the rest were scattered across the steppe in seemingly random order. We decided to leave the car on the hill and shouldered our backpacks, and headed toward the unknown. A narrow path, almost completely overgrown with grass, led us to that very place unmarked on maps. Yes, I was wrong calling this wasteland a village. We were greeted by rickety little houses made of clay and straw. In the center of the settlement stood a concrete building that must have been built during Soviet times. There wasn't a soul around, but that's exactly what we needed. The sun hadn't yet reached its zenith, which gave perfect lighting for shooting. Jessica quickly began putting on makeup and changing clothes while I prepared the equipment. She didn't even hide from me, since we'd done this many times before. And I was too absorbed in selecting the right location to even look toward the half-naked girl. Finally, we got down to what we came to this godforsaken place for. Jessica posed against one of the collapsed houses. Her snow-white dress flowed in the light breeze, and the grass gently tickled her bare legs. Sunlight seemed to envelop her silhouette, seeping through the loose fabric, and the play of shadows on the wall doubled her reflection on the building's wall, creating that very effect of second presence we wanted to achieve. The camera shutter clicked frantically. I only occasionally asked my friend to slightly change her pose. This was hard work. As soon as we tried all the angles and subjects in one location, we immediately ran to another before the sun's position changed, and we lost the right lighting. I didn't notice how 2 hours flew by. The sun went to its zenith, shadows stopped playing, and the air temperature exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. Typical May on the Black Sea coast. Jessica got tired and collapsed on a synthetic mat, and I carefully sat down next to her, groaning like an old man. Still, at 25, I should lead a more active lifestyle, considering that during shoots I often have to kneel, crawl holding afar from light camera, and often be in completely unnatural poses. Believe me, a photographer's work isn't just pressing a button like people think. What do you think happened to the people? What didn't they like here? Asked the girl, stretching her back. I think the land here is simply infertile, I shrugged. We often have droughts, and all the black soil is up north. Someone thought it would be good here but was wrong. Or maybe there's some poison in the soil that makes everyone sick. Or the radiation level is elevated, which the ancients took for a curse. Come on, there are no uranium deposits anywhere near here. And if someone had organized a burial ground here, it certainly wouldn't have been the Scythians 1,000 years ago. After resting a bit, we decided to look around. We still had several hours to look for new locations for shooting and satisfy our curiosity. Here Jessica and I also had similar views. First, we examined that very panel building in the center. It seemed to have once been something like a warehouse combined with a small office. Most likely the central building of a small collective farm. The other buildings were typical adobe huts, built no later than the first quarter of the 20th century. Their roofs had long since collapsed, cracks ran along the walls, and instead of windows, empty sockets stared at us. For a second, I even felt uncomfortable. Strange feelings. I'd been to abandoned hospitals, factories, dormitories many times before, but this time something was different. Open space, sunny day. But for some reason, this scared me more than dark corridors. This step, hills beyond which no civilization was visible, pressed down on me. The crumbling houses seemed somehow unnatural, as if they didn't belong to this place, as if someone had torn them from their rightful places and simply moved them here. One building differed from the others. Only when we got closer did we realize it was a small chapel. The metallic cross had long since rusted and broken under its own weight. Through the rotten boards, you could see right through the building. Most of the boards were charred from a fire. Perhaps this was the only building that didn't evoke that same effect of unnaturalness. The only thing that bothered us was the boarded-up entrance. Of course, the wood was already hanging by a thread, and it didn't take much effort for me to tear it off with one movement. Inside there was an unnatural coolness, even though the roof had long since collapsed, but the sun's rays seemed not to penetrate inside. We didn't pay attention to this then, and simply enjoyed the coolness, examining the chapel's crooked walls. "Look," Jessica touched my shoulder, pointing somewhere at the ground. It took me several seconds to make out the outline of a hatch covered with boards. After removing the debris, we discovered what could be an entrance to a secret cellar. But why would it be here? During the Revolution, they dug it to hide from the Reds. Was a very strange find. After exchanging glances, we nodded to each other. The rusty hinges literally fell apart at the slightest movement. Much more effort was needed to drag the hatch cover aside. It seemed to be made of quality wood since it had hardly rotted. Some white paint even remained on the reverse side. A damp smell wafted from the opened hole. "Well, you're wearing work clothes, so you go down first," Jessica quickly said, peering inside. Having been a speleologist, I was already experienced, so this wasn't new to me. I carefully descended the steps carved into the ground from stones and clay. Everything went surprisingly smoothly. The improvised staircase had perfectly preserved to our days. The shaft itself turned out to be shallow and quite spacious. Only the cold and stench of dampness bothered me terribly. I tried to pinch my nose, but it was useless. Goosebumps ran over my skin, not from fear, but from the frost that suddenly pierced me, as if I wasn't a couple meters underground, but in an icy tunnel. "How is it down there?" Jessica's voice echoed. "It's fine, you can come down." Turning on my flashlight, I began examining the tunnel. It was short, only about 5 meters. At the end stood a door as old as the entire chapel, almost completely fallen apart. It seemed to be held by one hinge and wasn't completely closed. It looked like there had once been a lock on it, but it had completely rusted and crumbled. "There's a tunnel here and some kind of door," I shouted up. "Come on down." "All right," she replied. A minute later, Jessica stood behind me. She was no longer wearing the snow-white dress, just loose shorts and a black t-shirt with a long faded print. We cautiously moved closer to the door. I only had to pull the handle slightly, and the entire structure simply fell apart, making a disgusting creak that echoed through the tunnel. I had to press against the wall so the rubble wouldn't crush me. A small room opened before us, but it didn't seem gloomy at all. On the contrary, it seemed like something was illuminating it. Soon, we understood what was creating such an effect. It looked like a slightly elongated sphere and seemed to hang in the air. A light fluorescent glow attracted us and seemed so warm in the cold of this dungeon. I reached out to this glowing ellipsoid, and suddenly everything disappeared. In an instant, the dungeon plunged into impenetrable darkness, and the warm rays were replaced by cold wind. Frost ran over my skin. The tunnel walls shook. Someone's growling echoed through the tunnel. First I ducked, instinctively covering my head with my hands, then turned and started running toward the exit. I was ready to grab Jessica under her arms and almost carry her out on my back, but she wasn't behind me. I didn't pay attention to this then. There simply wasn't time to think. I rushed to the exit and, reaching it, literally flew up the staircase carved into the ground. I probably lay on the floor of the destroyed chapel for several seconds, just trying to catch my breath. My head was buzzing. The world around me seemed to have collapsed. Clarity of mind returned gradually. The first thing I noticed was the sun descending toward the horizon. Could I really have spent several hours in that dungeon? Impossible. Not even 5 minutes had passed since all this happened. But that wasn't the most terrible thing. Jessica had disappeared somewhere. Fear and panic began to envelop me. Shouting the girl's name, I began running around the entire abandoned hamlet, but I didn't have to search long. The girl lay on the mat we had left earlier. Jessica, I shouted, running up to the girl. There was no answer. She just lay motionless, her face buried in the ground. At the same time, she was still wearing that same snow-white dress from the shoot. Anxiety increasingly gnawed at me. I quickly approached the girl and began shaking her by the shoulder. She still felt warm to the touch, but as soon as I turned her over, wide-open eyes immediately stared at me. Horror was frozen in them. The eyeballs had practically bulged out of their sockets. The pupils were constricted to the size of a needle point. A network of torn capillaries completely covered the whites. Her mouth was unnaturally wide open, so wide that the corners of her lips had cracked from stretching. Her twisted hands were frozen in the area of her heart. Screaming in horror, I instinctively recoiled, and my legs caught on the dead woman's ankle. I fell on my back and immediately began crawling away. I finally came to my senses in the hospital. Police officers were asking me something, but I couldn't give them any coherent answers. The district officer nodded, writing something in his notebook. The doctors gave me a sedative and left me in the ward for the night. Of course, no one told me anything. No matter how I tried to ask them about what happened to my friend, even despite the dose of medication, I couldn't fall asleep right away. Anxious thoughts still swarmed in my head. How could I have spent a whole 5 hours in that tiny dungeon? What did Jessica die from? Why was she even dressed in that white dress? There were only 2 possible answers to the last question. The first option: she got out before me, for some reason changed clothes, and then died. And if many questions remain here, the second option is much more terrifying. What if she didn't change clothes at all and didn't go down to the dungeon? But then who walked with me through the abandoned hamlet? Who was behind my back all this time in that tunnel? Such thoughts caused trembling. I tossed and turned for a long time, trying to fall asleep. First because of the endless questions circulating in my head, then from my own imagination. I imagined footsteps in the ward. I was alone, but the feeling that someone was watching me didn't leave me. I even got up to my full height, turned on the flashlight on my phone, and began examining the room. Nothing, no one. The night was just darkness. I didn't dream any dreams. Even without any nightmares, I woke up in a cold sweat. Causeless anxiety pressed on me, making me flinch at every rustle. I felt even more distinctly how someone was watching me. Suddenly, I heard the door open. I pressed into my hospital bed, but then I saw a doctor and nurse. They asked me several questions, wondering whether to send me home or not. I tried to find out at least something about what happened from them. Brain aneurysm, simply put, blood vessels in the cortex burst. The doctor finally gave in. No one is immune to this. It happens to both old and young people, although the situation is quite strange, I must say. Moreover, the toxicological examination showed nothing unusual. I'm not a doctor, but I know something about medicine. Blood vessels can burst from a sharp increase in pressure. But where could it come from? With a strong fright, the pulse sharply increases, adrenaline is released. Could Jessica really have died from fear? Her face, it froze in such a position, as if the girl had seen something very, very scary. No, not just scary, but terrifying to the depths of her soul. Something that could instantly kill a young and completely healthy person with its mere appearance. Finding myself beyond the hospital threshold, I was confused. Yes, I understood I had to go home, but at that moment I seemed to have forgotten where my rented apartment was located. The feeling of anxiety didn't go anywhere. On the contrary, it only grew. I stood on a busy street. The sun was shining brightly, but a strange sensation didn't leave me. It seemed to me that someone was following me. I literally felt someone's intent gaze on me. My eyes slid from one window to another, along corners and various shelters. Nothing and no one. Looking around and turning back every minute, I still managed to get home. After locking the door with both locks and the latch, I ran to the bathroom to wash my hands. Only when I put my palms under the stream of cool water did I notice how strong the trembling that gripped me was. My hands were overcome by tremor. My heart contracted so loudly and quickly. Only a double dose of valerian and a cold shower could bring me to my senses. The anxiety subsided a bit. I finally managed to regain clarity of mind. But at the same time, I seemed not to understand what I needed to do at all. Exactly the photographs. In my bag lay the camera. I quickly launched my laptop and inserted the memory card with our shots. Jessica, as always, looked beautiful. The photographs turned out simply excellent. This play of light and shadow, the perfectly chosen background, the outfit. Then melancholy hit. All the happy moments when we were together flashed through my head. No, we weren't destined to become a couple, but we were real friends and good colleagues. Sadness enveloped me with its sticky paws, lifting the brightest memories from the bottom of my mind. A killing dose of sedative didn't let me completely fall apart, but still, a tear rolled down my cheek. I probably would have cried completely if my attention hadn't been attracted by one very interesting, and at the same time terrifying detail. All these crooked little houses, tall grass, step hills, and even the sky seemed somehow unnatural, as if the entire landscape was simply drawn or woven from improvised materials, just like on a set in a film studio. I don't know what exactly created such an impression, but I seemed to feel it. But the worst was yet to come. I continued flipping through the photos, carefully peering into the surroundings. Here the girl languidly poses by a post, standing by a half-destroyed porch. Here she basks in the sun-scorched grass. And here, wait, what is that? In the darkness of a broken window, something unnatural was visible, as if from the inside, some nails were sticking out, driven around the entire diameter of the frame. I had to greatly enlarge the image to make them out. Strange, there was nothing like that during the shoot. I definitely would have noticed. In another photograph, the sun seemed somehow wrong, as if it was slightly elongated, resembling an ellipsoid rather than a sphere. In the empty doorway that was right behind the girl's shoulder, two barely noticeable lights seemed to burn. But what is this? It seemed like I was going crazy. After reviewing all the photos, I made sure that none of this was my imagination. My imagination immediately began to draw the most terrible pictures. Two lights' eyes, nails in the window frame teeth, and the wrong sun, exactly the same as that light in the tunnels under the chapel. The picture began to form in my head, the unnaturalness of what was happening, the alluring light, huge teeth. Anglerfish, I involuntarily said, the hellish creation of the ocean. A fish that lures its victims with fluorescent glow and then tears their bodies with its gigantic teeth. A real deep-sea monster. I didn't know what it was and how such a creature ended up in this abandoned hamlet, but the fact remains. How long has it been there? How many lives has it already taken? Did this creature devour Jessica? Did it eat her soul, take her mind into the depths of its bottomless maw? Anxiety began to overcome me again. My heart started pounding, breathing became uneven, and my hands began to shake. Someone's heavy gaze fell on my back. It was watching me from everywhere. I rushed around the entire apartment, but couldn't hide anywhere from the invisible pursuer. It was everywhere, under my bed, in the gap between the wardrobe and the wall, inside the closet, behind the bathroom door. I was going crazy. Hiding my head under the blanket, I curled up in a ball. I need to pull myself together. I tried to restore my breathing. It didn't help. I heard someone's footsteps. By that time, the line between reality and fantasy had finally blurred. It was coming to me with its quiet but confident step. Each of its steps was accompanied by disgusting squelching. The clicking of its toothy jaws reached my ears. No, it didn't breathe, it didn't need to, but it wanted to eat. Hoping to somehow get rid of the obsession, I began holding my breath. It helped. The lack of fresh air and psychological overstrain played their role. My eyelids closed and I fell into sleep. Only darkness and emptiness. No dreams, and that's for the better. I wouldn't have survived nightmares too. I woke up closer to evening from a strong feeling of hunger. The anxiety had receded. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw my swollen face with sunken cheeks. Several gray strands appeared on my temples and crown. Could I really have brought myself to such a state? A depressing sight. Taking yesterday's rice and cutlets from the refrigerator, I began heating them in the microwave. There was a ringing emptiness in my head. No thoughts, and that's for the better. While waiting for it to heat up, I took out my smartphone and decided to read the news. A reckless decision. Fire at the Second City Hospital extinguished an hour and a half after firefighters arrived. 2 deaths are known so far. 5 more are missing. Searches are being conducted by rescuers and volunteer forces. At that moment, I understood everything. It was following me, but what's worse, it was going over the heads of those I contacted. Like a virus. Invisible, contagious, deadly. Suddenly, I heard the creak of a door. It came from somewhere in the bedroom. My heart sank. I immediately recognized this sound. That's exactly how my wardrobe door opens. That's it came for me. It dealt with the witnesses, and now it came to me. No, I won't give up so easily. Rushing to the hallway, I began hastily putting on sneakers with one hand while feeling for the apartment key with the other. I didn't see its eyes, but I felt how dim light caressed the back of my head. It was getting brighter, and at some point I could even briefly see its reflection in the mirror. This meant only one thing: the toothy anglerfish was moving right behind me. Without even tying my shoelaces, I burst out the door and slammed it shut behind me. I ran out of the entrance so fast that I almost crashed into an old lady with heavy bags. "Oh Lord, Danny, are you?" she tried to tell me, but I didn't listen. As soon as I moved away a couple dozen meters, suddenly loud groans reached my ears. Turning around, I saw Catherine, that same grandmother I almost collided with under the entrance. Now she lay on the ground, clutching her heart with both hands. Forgive me, I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop. I just continued running further. The sun had almost hidden behind the horizon, and street lamps were already on. My heart was bursting from my chest, my lungs were stabbing, my legs hurt, but I didn't stop. People turned to look at me, but I didn't care about them. Only completely exhausted did I stop to rest. But as soon as I simply stopped, my knees immediately buckled and I fell to the ground, leaning my back against the wall of another 9-story panel building. Greedily gasping for air, I tried to restore my strength, but suddenly with peripheral vision, I noticed that one of the lanterns went out. Darkness reigned there in the distance. Then another lantern went out, closer to me. But soon the darkness was dispersed by dim, fluorescent glow. In the sparks of bursting light bulbs, I saw a human figure. It only remotely resembled a humanoid, but if you looked closely, its monstrous mouth immediately became noticeable, stretched across its entire head. Run, that's all I could do, and I ran until I encountered a patrol. "So you're being pursued by some invisible monster with a lantern on its head?" the investigator asked condescendingly. "You're laughing at me, but I'm telling the truth. You know about the hospital fire. You can check the data about my friend's death. If you want, call the ambulance, ask if Catherine was brought to them." I spoke, trying to pronounce words clearly and convincingly. "You can help me as you want. I'll take all the tests, answer any questions. Just leave me here in the isolation cell, and for God's sake, don't turn off the lights." The police didn't need much persuasion. It was already quite late, so no one wanted to mess around with me. They locked me in the drunk tank and went to continue their duty. The next morning, I was supposed to be taken for psychiatric evaluation. There was one more person sitting with me in the cell. He didn't talk to me, which I was only glad about. The man's head was shaved to a shine, and a tattoo depicting a crawling snake was visible on his neck. His ear was crumpled, and his knuckles were covered with calluses. A picture worth painting, I'd say. But actually, this person's presence calmed me instead. In general, the presence of at least someone nearby calmed my raging anxiety. However, dozens of thoughts still spun in my head. Would the police be able to stop it if it's invisible? Can it even be wounded by bullets? What if it cuts off the electricity and comes again in the darkness? Yes, it hides exactly in the dark. How did I not figure this out before? The dark tunnel, twilight, late evening in the city. Actually, deep in my soul, I dreamed that tomorrow they would simply declare me mentally ill, and all this would turn out to be just my inflamed delirium. The clock hands had long passed midnight, but I couldn't fall asleep. Anxious thoughts continued to climb into my head. That same feeling when the body is tired, but the mind still refuses to turn off. The fact that just over a year ago in this place, there was a mass murder added fuel to the fire. Officially, they announced it was a terrorist attack, but in our city, they heard about how after the storm of the century, bodies with limbs twisted in the other direction were taken from the stations. They say it was done by that same red steppe Satan who had previously killed half a dozen women. Strangely, after this incident, the maniac disappeared, But a couple of weeks later, a policeman who survived that massacre killed his ex-wife and daughter, after which he skinned them. A strange story. I specifically chose the bunk closest to the entrance so that as much light as possible would come to me from the corridor. Suddenly, somewhere in the distance, screams were heard. "Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! Johnson is having a bad time there." Hearing these words, I instantly jumped up from my bed. No, I wasn't crazy. Everything was happening for real. Only now I had nowhere to run. They locked me in a cage. First, I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs to let me out of here, but I quickly realized it was pointless. They wouldn't open the cage anyway, and I no longer had the strength to run. All that remained was to hope that the metal bars would protect me. There was a loud click, and the light immediately went out. The fluorescent lamps went out, plunging the police station into darkness. Now I truly panicked. My heart began beating 3 times per second. My breathing went astray. My hands were overcome by tremor. "Help! Help me!" I tried to scream, greedily gasping for air. Meanwhile, someone's screams again reached my ears. Then followed quick stomping that ended with the dull thud of a body falling to the floor. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear everything perfectly. The creature in the darkness was quietly wheezing. Soon disgusting chomping was heard, the sound of tearing fabric. By that time, my cellmate had already woken up and was walking around the cage with a confused face, trying to understand what was happening there. And then a dim light appeared. "Stay away from the bars." I couldn't finish speaking when something forcefully pressed the man against the metal bars, literally pressing him into them. He screamed, trying to break free from the ghostly grip, but the monster was strong and knew no mercy. In the darkness, huge teeth flashed. 30-centimeter fangs sank right into the back of the prisoner's head. A crunch was heard, and his skull cracked, spraying warm red liquid everywhere. The monster literally bit off his face completely, tearing it from the remaining half of his head. The body limply fell to the ground, still continuing to beat in convulsions. I could make out the anglerfish only when the victim's blood sprinkled it. Instead of a face, it had only a monstrous mouth with absolutely all sides studded with curved fangs. Somewhere on its forehead, 2 small eyes were visible. Its body resembled more a mixture of reptile and monkey than a human. Scaly arms covered with scales were disproportionately thin compared to the massive head, and the legs, bent in the opposite direction, turned out to be just bones covered with skin. The thin neck extended 1/2 meter, and somewhere above levitated a source of dim, fluorescent light. This was the physical embodiment of the monster. But as soon as it turned its head toward me, all the blood immediately fell to the floor, and its body turned into haze as dark as the darkness itself. It was here, in the same room with me. It slowly moved in my direction, continuously drilling me with its unblinking eyes. The fingers on its bent arms constantly moved, as if playing the piano, and its lower jaw twitched. I pressed into the corner of the cage, unable to look away from the deep-sea monster that had emerged from the depths of either the ocean or space itself into our world. It inexorably approached, looking at its last victim. I hope someone will read this diary. I just want someone to know my story. I wish no one else would encounter what I had to deal with. The monster spared me after all. I'm a carrier for it, and it's not profitable for a virus to kill the last spreader of infection. Therefore, I intend to end everything myself. Fortunately, I still know the formula for powerful explosives made from fertilizers and diesel fuel from my school days. I'll go to where it all began. I'll go down and make sure no one ever finds this place again and doesn't wake up the one who lives in the depths. The North is a harsh and beautiful place that attracts more and more people every year. Some go there for the extreme, some for big money, and some are drawn to local traditions and customs. But not everyone is welcomed warmly by this land. Not everyone gets to discover its secrets, and not everyone's journey there ends well. This unusual story happened to my friend Andrew Miller when he decided to travel to one of the remote settlements in Alaska, not only to improve his financial situation, but also to heal his emotional wounds after a divorce from his wife, who took their son and flew to another man on the East Coast. Andrew really fell apart and started drinking, and soon his boss called him into his office and politely asked him to write a resignation letter. So it's not surprising that having lost his job and family, the guy wanted to go somewhere far away and start everything anew. Therefore, the security guard vacancy with the combination of another position in a distant settlement was perceived by him as a sign from above. I remember he called me joyfully then and shared his plans. He said he'd go take a look at that very North, save up money, and solve all his problems. In that settlement, almost at the edge of the world, there's nowhere to spend money except on food. Housing is provided, vacation with solid payments is guaranteed, so everything is working out as well as possible. Even then, I felt some vague anxiety, but I attributed everything to ordinary concern that my friend was leaving, and we wouldn't be able to see each other soon. In addition, the argument that a change of scenery would do him good outweighed all my anxieties and fears. If only I had known how it would all end. After some time, Andrew, having gone through all possible authorities and collected a pile of documents, went by the nearest flight to Fairbanks. This city, beautiful in its own way, stretched along the bank of the mighty Yukon River, carrying its measured waters to the distant Bering Sea. Despite mid-August, the cold breath of northern latitudes was already felt here, and therefore my friend, accustomed to southern warmth, had to get another sweater from his suitcase. A few hours later, he transferred to a helicopter that was supposed to deliver him to his new workplace. Andrew was flying in such transport for the first time, and therefore the flight left unforgettable impressions in every sense. On one hand, the young man admiringly examined the beauties of the tundra. On the other hand, due to the noise of rotating blades and the smell of fuel in the cabin, he felt so bad that by the end of the flight, he looked like a chewed lemon. When the helicopter landed, Andrew was among the first to exit the cabin, and with joy took a full breath of clean, fresh northern air. Since the helicopter pad was located not far from the settlement and was situated on a hill, he could examine the tundra spreading to the very horizon. Not a single tree, even the most miserable one, just an endless sea of grass, moss, and shrubs. Autumn had not yet entered its rights, and therefore the tundra, using the brief period of relative warmth, sparkled with bright colors and pleased the eye of those around. The settlement spread over several hills and was open from all sides to the endlessly blowing wind here. Cold and piercing to the bones, it gradually raised clouds of fine sand, which forced my friend literally, in the first days of his stay, to acquire not only several warm sweaters knitted by local craftswomen, but also ski goggles. First of all, Andrew headed to meet the head of the settlement. His office was located in a former floating store, repaired and converted for the needs of the administration. The local post office, military registration office, and pharmacy were also located there. Finding the door he needed, Andrew knocked and with some timidity opened the door. The office he entered looked surprisingly decent. "Andrew Miller, greetings, come in," said a not young, but outwardly attractive Native American, smiling and rising from behind the desk. Extending and shaking hands with the newly minted employee, he gestured for him to sit on a chair with a soft back and leather-upholstered armrests. "My name is Joseph Crowfeather. I was the one who called you about your resume." "Yes, I already figured that out," Andrew also smiled in response. "How do you like our settlement? Are you scared?" "No, it's quite unusual here, but beautiful in its own way, though the wind is very annoying." "Nothing, you'll get used to it soon and won't pay any attention to it. The main thing is to buy good boots and a raincoat, because it will start raining soon and it will become too damp here. And you need to keep your feet warm in our parts," Joseph Crowfeather advised somewhat poetically. "Thank you for the good advice," Andrew replied with gratitude in his voice. Then they spent about an hour discussing the work schedule, clarifying job responsibilities, signing all sorts of papers. After that, Andrew was given a 1-year contract and introduced to his direct supervisor, Robert Two Bears, a lean, weathered Native American who was already in his 5th decade, turned out to be quite hospitable and pleasant in communication. He thoroughly questioned my friend, not only about his previous workplace, but also about his family. For locals, such questioning was in order, since everyone in the village had long known everything about each other, and each new person caused genuine curiosity and interest. Robert even jokingly warned Andrew that he needed to be on guard. Otherwise, he wouldn't notice how he'd be quickly married to one of the local women and made a reindeer herder. After the briefing, issuing necessary devices and equipment, Two Bears, as Andrew mentally decided to call him for himself, led him to familiarize himself with the work area. It was located in the most distant northern, half-abandoned part of the settlement. There, but closer to the river, was also located the local weather station, somewhat battered by weather and time. Part of its antennas had rusted and tilted, and one of the satellite dishes seemed about to collapse. In the distance, on the slopes of 2 steep hills, old houses seemingly hastily assembled from improvised materials and huge cisterns, with windows and doors cut into them, were scattered here and there. It turned out that people used to live in these wondrous structures, even whole families, but over time they all received good housing and moved. Some were lucky enough to get an apartment even in Fairbanks, but the local administration still somehow never got around to demolishing all this junk. In addition to the half-destroyed houses and weather station, this area of the settlement housed an operating store called Northern Lights, as well as 2 abandoned buildings, a hospital and a kindergarten. Although the staff of these institutions with patients and children had long since moved to new comfortable buildings in the center of the settlement, the old ones were not demolished, but continued to be used as dormitories for visitors. Shortly before Andrew's arrival, the hospital building was urgently closed, officially due to emergency conditions, but according to rumors. Our people say the reason is different, Robert Two Bears said carefully, but confidently. What kind? Andrew asked with genuine interest. He had been a strange lover of mysterious and scary stories since childhood. People say all sorts of things, but the rumors aren't good, Two Bears replied, as if wanting to end the conversation on this topic and not frighten the visitor. But still, tell me. As a security guard, I should know what's happening on my section, Andrew asked more insistently, anticipating hearing something interesting. Well, they say people started disappearing in that building. Strange noises at night, and in the morning, one of the residents is gone. And those living there started getting very sick, so sick that some were evacuated by special flight to the mainland. Two Bears added, "Don't take this to heart, but don't forget to take matches with you when you go on night shift." "But I don't smoke. This isn't for cigarettes. At night here you can't go out without matches or a lighter. It's a bad omen." "Really? Okay, I'll take them. What other omens do you have here?" "Well, in the tundra you can't whistle or shout too loudly, you'll bring trouble. And there's much more," Two Bears said, smiling for the first time. "You can't list it all at once. You'll learn everything yourself over time. Now go rest. Your first patrol of the area is tonight." Andrew gladly took advantage of this advice, and therefore by the start of his shift, he was fresh as a cucumber. The sun had long since set behind the horizon, and night darkness covered the settlement with a gloomy blanket. Rare lanterns formed small light spots around themselves, though this made the darkness even thicker and more impenetrable. The newly minted guard began patrolling his section. He walked unhurriedly, trying to catch at least some sounds, but such silence reigned around that, for a second, it even seemed to Andrew that someone had specifically covered his ears with their palms. For a person who lived day and night in the endless cacophony of a big city, the roar of construction sites, the noise of cars, endless music pouring from all sides, such silence seems strange and even frightening. It seems that some unknown will has left you alone in this huge and unpredictable world. Continuing to listen and thinking about something of his own, Andrew soon reached the building of the former hospital. The guard had already been told that hooligan youth used to like to gather here, but in connection with recent events, even they had found another place. Just in case, Andrew decided to examine the territory around the building. The doors and windows of the shabby two-story structure were tightly boarded up. However, in the end wall, he noticed a fairly wide crack through which even an adult could squeeze. Coming closer, Andrew listened, and at that moment, an incomprehensible gust of icy wind almost knocked him off his feet. My friend was ready to swear that at the same time he heard someone's voice. It was unpleasant and inspired fear. Although Andrew had not been of the timid sort since childhood, his first thought was to get away from this place and not return. However, a moment later, stubbornness and the desire to prove that he was not weak took precedence over the sense of self-preservation. "Yeah, right, it's just locals decided to test me," Andrew thought. "They wanted to scare me and see how I'd run away from here. Oh no, that won't work. Now let's see who's the weakling." Gathering his courage, despite all the self-reassurance, Andrew still felt uneasy. The guard carefully squeezed inside. When his eyes got used to the darkness, he saw that he was in a hospital corridor. After waiting another couple of seconds, Andrew slowly went forward. Empty rooms of offices and wards gaped on the sides. Doors were torn off their hinges and lay nearby. The floor was littered with bottles, cigarette butts, and other much less pleasant objects. Trying to move as quietly as possible, Andrew looked into every room but never saw anyone or anything suspicious. Only the piercing whistle of wind, occasionally rushing through the cracks of boarded windows, made him shudder and look around more carefully. During his movement through the corridor, Andrew didn't turn on his flashlight and certainly didn't call out to anyone. First, he thought this might scare away potential hooligans whom he hoped to catch off guard. And second, inner intuition told him that being as inconspicuous as possible was now safest. Reaching the middle of the corridor, Andrew found himself in the central hall of the hospital. From there, a staircase led upstairs where the main entrance used to be. There was especially a lot of garbage, furniture fragments, and other junk here. There was also a foul smell here. Not even that. It was a nauseating stench of rotting bodies, from which the guard felt a lump rise to his throat, and a wild desire to quickly get rid of the simple dinner that hadn't yet had time to digest in his stomach. Deciding that he'd had enough, and that no hooligans were worth staying here even another minute, Andrew turned back. And suddenly, he froze in horror. Against the opening in the wall appeared someone's silhouette. The figure stood motionless, and it seemed to Andrew that it was looking directly at him. His palms instantly became sweaty, and his forehead was covered with cold perspiration. The guard couldn't understand why this suddenly appeared figure caused such terrible fear in him. Yes, Andrew was scared. His heart was beating frantically and seemed ready to jump out of his chest. Suddenly, the strange silhouette darted to the side and disappeared from view as suddenly as it had appeared. Coming to his senses, Andrew realized that whoever that stranger was, he didn't want to meet him under any circumstances. Therefore, he decided not to return through the opening in the wall, but to go up to the second floor. Finding himself there, my friend first carefully looked around. Here was exactly the same corridor, but unlike the first floor, the windows in the end walls were not so thoroughly boarded up, and therefore the darkness was not so thick. Trying to step very quietly, the guard just in case took out a stun gun from his pocket. Of course, this item was not included in the standard equipment, but Andrew always played it safe and took this means of self-defense with him, which had saved him more than once in difficult situations. Suddenly, the young man felt that someone was intently watching him from the darkness. Turning around, he froze in horror because he again saw the familiar, ominous silhouette. This time it stood by the window at the opposite end of the corridor. Andrew felt that a little more and a panic attack would overtake him. Thoughts raced feverishly. He needed to urgently do something, but he stood as if hypnotized, unable even to move from his place. At the same moment, the figure quickly rushed toward him with some jerky movements, and Andrew again felt the breath of icy wind, carrying the smell of rotting human bodies on him. Screaming piercingly, Andrew rushed to the opening of the end window, which luckily turned out to be unboarded after all, and jumped out of it, regardless of the height. Falling on soft, springy from moisture earth that softened the fall, Andrew, overcoming pain in his back and legs, stumbling and falling, ran forward without looking back, just to get away from this terrible place. Having run some distance, he stopped to catch his breath. Obeying some sixth sense, he looked back toward the hospital with apprehension, but saw no one. Moreover, no one was chasing him. It was just as deserted and quiet around. Only in the distance, Somewhere dogs barked several times. Could all this have just seemed to me, or damn it, was it still a stupid prank? He thought. Most likely the locals conspired and staged a real show for him, scaring him half to death, and he, like the last fool, was happy to fall for this scam. That same two bears started telling him about local superstitions and stories right away, probably frightening him along with the rest. Yes, most likely that's how it is, a stupid prank. However, no matter how much Andrew tried to convince himself that they had played a joke on him, deep down he felt it wasn't so. He had really encountered something sinister and very dangerous, and therefore he wouldn't agree to go to the abandoned hospital again for any money, even in broad daylight. In the morning, Andrew went to report to his boss and asked permission not to approach the hospital during night rounds. He was ready for two bears to laugh at him or make fun of him, saying he was scared of some stories, but he treated his request very seriously and gave his consent. They never returned to this question. Andrew's life went on. Days, weeks, months passed. No strange incidents happened to my friend during this time, so gradually memories of that nightmare became blurred and forgotten. Andrew made new acquaintances, often visited the locals, who even gave him a set of national clothing and several beautiful amulets, supposedly repelling evil spirits. He liked the charms so much that he constantly carried them with him. His financial situation and the calm, measured life in the settlement quite suited Andrew, and gradually it began to seem that life had completely improved. But when only a few weeks remained until vacation, a terrible incident occurred that forever changed his life. On one of the last night shifts, my friend, as usual, was passing by the building of the former kindergarten. It was located not far from the hospital, which Andrew still treated with caution. However, months of duty without any serious incidents had dulled his fear. Now the guard was no longer afraid to make rounds not far from the structure, sometimes even chasing local hooligans away from there. Andrew looked at his watch. 10 minutes past 2, soon sunrise. The sky was gradually being painted in red-yellow tones. The approach of the polar day was coming, so dawn was beginning much earlier than usual. Suddenly, Andrew heard someone's laughter. Turning around, he managed to notice how several figures ran up to the hospital and crawled inside through that same opening in the end part of the building. Of course, he couldn't see faces since he was still at quite a distance, but it was clearly living people who had penetrated there. Well, here we go again. Damn it, as soon as the May holidays arrived, the kids are already here as if on cue, hiding in abandoned places to drink and smoke. Nothing to do about it. I'll have to chase these brats away. Although the unpleasant memories immediately made themselves known, Andrew decided that since living people had penetrated the building, nothing terrible like last time would happen. After checking his equipment and getting out pepper spray just in case, the guard approached that same opening. Laughter and conversations were coming from there. It seemed the teenagers weren't afraid that someone might find them here at such a time, and therefore they behaved quite boldly. Taking a deep breath, and for some reason suddenly crossing himself, Andrew squeezed through the already familiar opening and carefully walked down the corridor. It was still just as cluttered. Now it seemed not as gloomy as last time, but Andrew still felt uncomfortable here. His fingers began to tingle unpleasantly. His breathing quickened. He shouldn't panic now, or he'd really make himself look like a fool in front of the whole settlement. Andrew took several deep breaths and exhales, and then, having calmed down, went further down the corridor. Judging by the sounds, the company had settled in one of the rooms closer to the main entrance. The guard specifically decided not to call out to the teenagers now, so that he could properly scare them later, thus discouraging them from wandering around such places. Moving carefully toward the center, Andrew almost fell, slipping on something sticky and dark. He cursed to himself, since he had only recently bought good shoes at almost 3 times the price, and now he'd have to wash it, and hopefully it would come clean, or he'd have to spend money again. Not having time to think about upcoming expenses, Andrew suddenly stopped abruptly. All extraneous thoughts instantly vanished, because a sharp smell hit his nose that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Getting worried, the guard turned on his flashlight with trembling hands and shined it at his feet, just as he thought. The entire floor was flooded with blood. It was fresh and flowed in streams from the room where the laughter was coming from. And then Andrew realized that there was something wrong with this laughter. It was unnatural, fake, repetitive, as if recorded on tape. Former fears swept over the man with new force. Panic and horror grew like a snowball, and his arms and legs refused to obey. Suddenly the laughter stopped, and shuffling steps were heard. Several figures appeared in the opening, and Andrew screamed hysterically, "Creatures!" Only from a distance could they be mistaken for people, but up close their appearance was simply horrible. Instead of heads, these beings had deer skulls with broken antlers and rotting remains of meat inside. In the eye sockets blazed red fire. From their hands, which were not only longer than human, but also ended in sharp claws, hung rotting, peeling skin in shreds. One of the creatures laughed terrifyingly and rushed at Andrew. At this moment, the guard's ability to move returned, and he rushed headlong toward the exit. Animal fear gave him strength, and he ran as he had never run in his life. But when he was already at the very exit, the building suddenly swayed, and Andrew fell, hitting his head hard on some piece of iron. From the sharp pain, he momentarily lost his sight and couldn't figure out what to do next. Only the instinct of self-preservation told him he needed to run, run, run. And then he felt sharp claws dig into his shoulder. Warm blood flowed under his clothes. Andrew screamed at the top of his lungs, began kicking, and desperately waving off the creature attacking him. He understood that the forces were unequal, but he didn't want to give up just like that either. The building suddenly swayed again, and the creature flew somewhere to the side. Andrew was able to get up. Now he dimly distinguished the silhouettes of 3 creatures in front of him. Their eyes blazing with fire stared at him unblinkingly, and in this gaze was such malice and hatred that his soul was ready to fly out of his body. Andrew got out his long knife, which he never parted with. He had already resigned himself to the fact that he wouldn't be able to get out of here, since he felt his strength leaving him. However, he also knew that before the inevitable end, he would definitely take a couple of these creatures with him. Suddenly, there was a deafening crack, followed by a dull rumble. Andrew didn't have time to understand anything when the floor beneath him collapsed, and the guard fell somewhere down with a scream, after which complete darkness set in. Consciousness slowly returned to Andrew. At first, he heard ringing that seemed to pierce through his skull, making his eyelids tremble. Then he felt his head burning with pain, and finally felt the pulsation of blood responding throughout his body with sharp needles. Having come to his senses, the guard tried to move his arms and legs, but every movement responded in him with such piercing pain that his eyes darkened again. It seemed he had been seriously hurt while falling. His entire face was smeared with blood that had already dried and turned into a crust. With difficulty getting up, Andrew wiped his eyes, but could practically see nothing, since impenetrable darkness reigned around. Only some strange ringing came from somewhere ahead. The ground beneath him was cold and rocky, and judging by the sound that was carried by dull echo, Andrew realized he was in a spacious room. It seemed there was an underground grotto under the hospital building that no one knew about. However, this wasn't important now. The important thing was to find an exit. His flashlight had rolled away somewhere in the darkness during the fall, but matches were still with him. Thanks to two bears for the advice. Andrew lit one of them, but its flame was so dim and small in this impenetrable darkness that for now he had to abandon the idea of examining anything with their help. Andrew tried to get up, but immediately his head started spinning. After waiting some more time to maintain balance, he decided to get out of this accursed place as soon as possible. He didn't know where the creatures that had attacked him in the hospital had gone. Perhaps they were somewhere here, waiting for him, but neither their terrible laughter nor their shuffling steps were heard. Only a distant, quiet ringing, and most likely that's where the exit to the surface was. As far as he remembered, not far from the hospital was the water treatment plant. So it was quite possible that this was the sound of working engines. Moving forward carefully, Andrew held his hands out in front of him so as not to accidentally run into obstacles. How long he walked like this was unclear. It seemed time had stopped, and there was only darkness, he, and the strange ringing. Maybe I died, and this is my soul now wandering here as restless, Andrew thought. The fall was probably fatal, and now I'm stuck between two worlds. Or is this actually that very transition to another world? Suddenly the guard caught on something and fell. His scraped knee immediately responded with burning pain. Still alive after all, Andrew said, and lit a match. The small flame illuminated some strange object. Looking more carefully, the man was stunned. It was a skeleton. Andrew hastily began crawling away from the remains, but then again felt his back pressing against something sharp. He lit several matches at once, which for a brief moment illuminated the ground strewn with human remains. Horror again took possession of the young man. It seemed these creatures had been living here for a very long time, and now they had reached the surface. Andrew felt sick just from the thought that all these months he had been calmly walking around up there, when monsters had been devouring people underground all this time. And what was worst of all was that they might be here, very close. As if in confirmation of his fears, that familiar, terrible laughter sounded in the distance to the right, joined by bird-like clucking. Fear of the prospect of meeting these creatures here, in an unknown dark place without protection and the possibility of hiding, spurred Andrew to move forward as quickly as possible. He stumbled, fell more than once, scraping his hands and feet, but continued to move forward. Meanwhile, laughter and other strange sounds were heard from the left and behind. They were getting louder. It seemed they were catching up with him. Andrew was almost running forward blindly, just to be further away from these monsters thirsting for his death. And finally, ahead appeared a bright reddish glow. Rejoicing that the exit was already so close, Andrew rushed forward with all his might. He was saved. He was able to do it. Having run to the opening from which light was pouring, Andrew froze in horror. Before him stretched an incredibly huge cave valley whose vaults went up to an unimaginable height. Icy wind drove clouds of snow and dust between rocks and gorges, fanning countless crimson fires burning with hundreds and thousands of lights near strange teepees. Dark silhouettes similar to those he had seen during his first visit to the abandoned hospital flickered next to them. Instantly dropping to the ground, Andrew began fearfully examining the picture that opened before him. "No, this can't be, this can't be. This is a dream, he mumbled. Despair completely took possession of him, taking away his last strength. Enemies were everywhere. Here everything was simply swarming with these creatures. There was no way out. As if in confirmation of his bitter thoughts, that familiar laughter sounded behind him and muffled stamping. The monsters would soon come here, and then he wouldn't survive. Deciding that there was at least some chance of salvation ahead, Andrew crawled toward the nearest teepee. It was located apart from the others, and no creatures were visible around it. Having reached the structure and pressed his back against it, Andrew looked around. Not far away, several dozen dwellings stood in a circle. Their tops glowed with bloody light from which bizarre shadows danced on the surrounding rocks. The man felt even more uneasy. Everything around was too unnatural, implausible, and at the same time real. Near one of the teepees, Andrew made out a fairly large group of frightening silhouettes. Creatures with long claws and deer skulls, instead of heads, huddled close to each other and seemed to be discussing something. Taking advantage of the situation, Andrew, trying not to make noise, half-bent, ran to a pile of boulders. From there, he could go to the side, away from the dwellings. Already there, behind the stones, he noticed something resembling a trench that skirted the teepees with their terrible inhabitants and went somewhere far to the side. This was what he needed. Suddenly, the flap of the nearest teepee was thrown back, and several more creatures came out. Andrew quickly pressed against the stones. The beings stood and seemed to sniff the air. The man froze and even stopped breathing for a while. But suddenly something crawled near his feet, touching his boots. Looking at this something, Andrew almost screamed with disgust and horror. A huge white worm covered with dully glowing slime was slowly sliding down the slope toward the teepees. Its segmented body, as thick as a human thigh, was disgustingly pulsating. Andrew felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to rush anywhere without thinking, just not to see this disgusting creature. But something inside told him he shouldn't do this. Literally, the next minute, he had to make sure his decision was right. One of those creatures with a deer-like head met this worm on its path. Upon seeing the worm, it, like all the others who saw it, tried to run. However, the worm, arching, caught its victim with one throw, instantly tore it to pieces and devoured it. Having finished its meal, the worm burrowed into the ground. Thank God I could have been in its place, Andrew thought with fear. Taking advantage of the confusion in the enemy camp, the guard slowly, pressing against the stones, crawled toward the trench. It turned out it had some kind of branch that smoothly turned into a tunnel leading somewhere upward. Perhaps this was the exit to the surface. Inspired by this assumption, Andrew walked more energetically forward. However, the further he went, the more he doubted it, and the following terrible finds completely confirmed his doubts. Human, wolf, and deer skulls were hung everywhere along the walls. The bloody light that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time illuminated quite well these terrible, like from some hunter's collection, trophies. The tunnel soon began not only to narrow, but also to go vertically upward. Steps appeared on the floor, carved for a foot much larger than human. Instinctively, Andrew understood he shouldn't go there. He wanted to turn back when suddenly he felt some unknown force drawing him to itself. He tried to resist it, but in vain. The evil will easily suppress his resistance. His thoughts were confused, feelings mixed, but he couldn't do anything about it. He was a prisoner of his own body, obediently going toward his death. Tears flowed from his eyes by themselves. Morally, he was already broken from everything he had seen and experienced. Andrew suddenly stopped being afraid, and only somewhere in the depths of his subconscious, resentment made itself known. Resentment that he would forever remain in this accursed place. Quite quickly, the tunnel walls expanded, and Andrew found himself in a cave as huge as the previous one. Throwing his head back high, he saw an incredible picture. The northern lights playing with green, red, and purple colors. This mesmerizing spectacle could be beautiful if not for one thing. The streams came from huge red teepees whose frames were assembled from human bones. A red light broke through from under the flaps of these strange dwellings, and terrible mournful chants reached him, from which frost ran over his skin. Andrew tried once more to subordinate his body to his will, but he was led like a marionette, inexorably toward the huge structures, whose crossed tops were lost in the distant heights. Around them, a huge whirlwind of darkness and smoke rotated silently, and the entire ground was strewn with bones, on which not only already familiar white worms crawled, but also other, more terrible creatures. Their appearance was so disgusting that Andrew's consciousness protected itself from them with a psychological barrier, erasing them from memory forever. They stopped him near a teepee from which, throwing back the flap, came an ugly old woman with a huge round mouth full of sharp teeth. She touched Andrew with her three-fingered hands and laughed evilly. "Well, here's a new toy." He mentally heard her voice, like the scratching of claws. "You will forever remain in my father's kingdom." Then she took him by the hand and dragged him into her teepee. My friend understood that as soon as he crossed the threshold, death would come. And when it seemed everything was over, he suddenly heard a voice sounding from somewhere far away. It nevertheless gained strength and soon shook this cave. The earth trembled, and the terrible old woman froze as if paralyzed. At the same moment, the unknown will released its grip, and Andrew suddenly felt he could control his body again. Yielding to a strange impulse, he pulled out from the inner pocket of his jacket an amulet that he had received as a gift from a familiar Native American, and threw it with force into the old woman's face. She screamed so loudly that his ears were blocked. With inhuman speed, she dove into the teepee and continued howling like a wounded beast. Meanwhile, the voice urged Andrew on and seemed to tell him where to go. He obediently followed its instructions until he again felt the iron grip of an unknown force pulling him back. The otherworld didn't want to give up its prey, and a fierce struggle ensued. Ancient evil living somewhere at the edge of the world, in the very depths of the earth, wanted to prove its superiority, and therefore sent all its servants in pursuit, thirsting to fulfill their master's will at any cost. Behind him, Andrew already heard distant stomping, the howling of wind, and loud rustling. All sorts of creatures of this world rushed toward him, wanting to carry out their Lord's will. Suddenly, a bright flash like lightning illuminated the entire space, and at this moment, Andrew looked back. An even more huge teepee than those 7 he had seen before. The giant flap was thrown back, and in the opening appeared the figure of a colossus, from the sight of which Andrew's mind became clouded, and an inhuman scream burst from his chest. What happened next, Andrew doesn't remember, just as he can't explain to those who found him why he ended up so far in the tundra, all covered in blood and wounds. Later, my friend was transported by special flight to Fairbanks, where he was given proper medical care. A few days later, Robert Two Bears contacted him and promised that the administration would provide him with any help. Andrew told practically nothing to the local police about the incident, making up a short story about someone hitting him on the head, after which he woke up where he was found. This version looked quite plausible, and no one bothered him with questions anymore, except for Two Bears. The Native American understood everything perfectly and only asked if the amulet he had given Andrew had helped him. Nodding affirmatively, my friend couldn't resist and told him about everything he had seen, everything he remembered. Robert listened to his story with a grim expression, and then told him about local legends, about terrible spirits waiting in the underground world, about flesh-devouring huge worms, and also about the daughters of the ruler of this terrible world. It was his dwelling, the inhabitants, his daughters that Andrew had seen. That old woman who wanted to take him to her was known by the name of Winter Hag. It was she who sent diseases to people and took the strongest men to her terrible lair. And that being that Andrew glimpsed in the giant bone teepee hidden in a whirlwind of darkness was none other than the Great Darkness, and good spirits had saved Andrew's life. At the end of his story, Robert Two Bears said sadly, "The Great Darkness doesn't forgive such actions, so my advice to you is to leave here as soon as possible." Andrew agreed with him and flew home on the first flight. I tried to help him, but healing emotional wounds was not within my power. Therefore, I advised Andrew to go to some monastery where they know about such matters and could help him. My friend did just that, and after some time, he reported that he had not only gotten rid of obsessive memories, but had also decided to become a monk. Well, and I made a vow never to visit those places where the mighty ruler Great Darkness dwells. A dusty sunbeam lazily broke through the murky, long unwashed glass of my studio apartment window in downtown Portland, falling across the kitchen table cluttered with bills, junk mail, and takeout containers. It illuminated a stark white rectangle against the stained, peeling contact paper, an old envelope. The envelope was cream-colored but yellowed at the edges, as if it had been pulled from some forgotten attic trunk where it had lain for decades. It was stained with something dark and dried that reminded me unpleasantly of either mud or... No, I didn't want to think about what else it could be. No return address, just my name scrawled in fading blue ink with shaky, elderly handwriting. Portland, Oregon, Northwest 23rd Avenue, Apartment 12, to Anthony Blackwood. The postmark was smudged, but I could make out Ravenshallow, Oregon. A name that stirred no memories except a vague sense of deep wilderness. The kind of place you'd find at the very edge of the map. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling an inexplicable chill run down my spine. The past few months had been strange enough already. Nothing dramatic, just an accumulation of small, unsettling incidents that left me on edge. Vivid nightmares that felt more real than dreams, faces in crowds that belonged to people I knew were dead, objects that vanished and reappeared in impossible places. The stress of graduate school, I told myself. The aftermath of my recent breakup with Rebecca. Nothing more. But this letter felt different. It smelled of secrets and shadows, of a past I'd tried to forget. With trembling fingers, I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in quarters, covered in that same shaky handwriting. "Dear Anthony, my precious grandson, my last hope," the letter began. "This is your grandmother, Constance Blackwood, mother of your father William. May his soul find peace, though I fear it may not. Do you remember me, child? Perhaps you recall the summer you spent in Ravenshallow when you were 7, before your mother took you away to the city. I'm old now, Anthony, so very old. My body fails me, my mind wanders in shadows. One foot rests already in the grave, the other barely holds me to this world. I am alone in this place where our family has dwelt for generations, among the ancient trees and forgotten paths. There is so much you don't know, so much your parents kept from you. But time grows short, and the burden must pass to someone. You are the last of our line, the only one who can continue what we have guarded for so long. Come to me, Anthony. Come before it is too late. The address is on the envelope. Ask anyone in Ravenshallow for the Blackwood house. They all know it, though few will speak of it willingly. There are things that must be explained, traditions that must be maintained, responsibilities that cannot be abandoned. The shadows grow restless, and I fear what will happen if they are left unguarded. Your loving grandmother, Constance." I read the letter 3 times, each pass bringing back more fragments of that long-ago summer. The memory was hazy, like looking through frosted glass, but I could recall a tall, gaunt woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of obsidian. She had frightened me then, though I couldn't remember why. The house came back to me too. A sprawling Victorian mansion perched on a hill overlooking the small town. Its windows always dark. Its gardens overgrown with thorns and strange plants that seemed to writhe in the shadows. My mother had come to collect me after only 3 weeks, her face white with rage and fear. She and my father had fought about it for hours behind closed doors, their voices rising and falling like storm waves. After that, my father was forbidden from mentioning his family, and Ravenshallow became just another buried memory. That evening, when my mother called for our weekly check-in, I showed her the letter. She went quiet for a long moment, then asked me to read it aloud. When I finished, she was silent for nearly a minute. "Constance Blackwood," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I hoped she was dead. "Mom, what's this about? What happened in Ravenshallow?" "Nothing good, Anthony. Nothing you need to know about." But then she sighed, and I could hear her settling into her chair. "Your father's family, they were involved in things, dark things, old traditions that should have died out centuries ago." "What kind of traditions?" "The kind that twisted people's souls, Anthony. The kind that made children disappear and crops fail and animals birth monsters. Your grandmother was the worst of them all. She had a gift, they said, but it was a cursed gift. She could speak with things that should stay silent. make bargains with forces that should remain unnamed. My mother's voice dropped to a whisper. I saw things in that house, Anthony, things that still wake me up at night. Your father tried to break away from it all, but it followed him. It's why he started drinking, why he couldn't hold a job. The shadows, he called them. Said they were always watching, always waiting. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Oregon rain pattering against my windows. What happened to him? He died trying to escape them. The car accident. It wasn't an accident, Anthony. He drove that car into the river on purpose, trying to drown the voices that had been calling to him for years. The words hit me like a physical blow. My father's death had been ruled an accident, but there had always been questions. No skid marks, no sign of mechanical failure. Just a man who drove his car off a bridge on a clear, dry night. Don't go to Ravenshallow, my mother said urgently. Whatever she wants from you, whatever inheritance she's offering, it's not worth it. The Blackwood line needs to end with you, Anthony. Let the shadows starve. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and family secrets have a way of demanding to be uncovered. Despite my mother's warnings, despite the fear in her voice, I found myself researching flights to Oregon, looking up directions to Ravenshallow. I told myself I was going for closure, to understand the father I'd never really known. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something was calling me back to that dark house on the hill, something that had been waiting for 20 years. The flight to Medford was turbulent, the kind of rough air that makes you question your life choices. I rented a car at the airport and drove north through the Cascade Mountains, following winding roads that grew progressively narrower and more isolated. Ravenshallow was exactly as I remembered it. A cluster of weathered buildings nestled in a valley between forested ridges, looking like it had been forgotten by the modern world. The few people I saw on the streets hurried past with their heads down, as if they were afraid of being noticed. I stopped at a gas station to ask for directions to the Blackwood house. The attendant, a grizzled man in his 60s, looked at me with undisguised alarm when I mentioned the name. "You're one of them, aren't you?" he said, backing away from the counter. "Should have known you've got the look." "What look?" "The shadow look, like you're not quite all there, like part of you is somewhere else." He shook his head. "Take the old mountain road out of town, follow it until you see the iron gates. But mister, if you've got any sense, you'll turn around and go back where you came from." The iron gates were exactly where he'd said they'd be, tall and imposing, and covered with rust and strange symbols that hurt to look at directly. They stood open, as if they'd been waiting for me. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, but my rental car managed to navigate the ruts and potholes. And there, at the end of the drive, stood the house I remembered from my nightmares. The Blackwood mansion was a monument to Gothic excess, all towers and turrets and windows that seemed to watch like eyes. Ivy covered much of the facade, and the gardens had gone wild, creating a jungle of thorns and shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I parked in front of the main entrance and sat for a moment, gathering my courage. The house felt alive somehow, as if it were breathing, waiting. I could see a light in one of the ground floor windows, warm and yellow and inviting. The front door was massive, carved with more of those symbols I couldn't quite focus on. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door swung open on its own. "Anthony," said a voice from the darkness beyond, "I've been waiting for you." She stepped into the light, and I felt my breath catch. Constance Blackwood was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles and shadows, but her eyes were exactly as I remembered them. Black as midnight, sharp as glass, holding depths I didn't want to explore. "Hello, grandmother," I managed to say. She smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too sharp. "Come in, child, come home." The interior of the house was a labyrinth of dark wood and darker shadows. Portraits of long-dead Blackwoods watched from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow my movement. The air was thick with the scent of old roses and something else, something that made my skin crawl. "Tea?" Constance asked, leading me into a sitting room dominated by a massive fireplace. "I've prepared your favorite lemon and honey, just as you liked it when you were small." I accepted the cup with trembling hands, noting how her fingers seemed to move independently of her will, like spiders crawling across the porcelain. The tea was hot and sweet, but there was an undertaste that made me think of soil and decay. "You want to know why I called you here?" she said, settling into a chair that seemed to be made of shadows. "You want to understand what happened to your father, what's been calling to you all these years." "What's been calling to me?" "Don't pretend you haven't felt it, Anthony. The dreams, the visions, the sense that you're being watched. It's your heritage, your birthright, the power that runs in Blackwood blood." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "We are guardians, Anthony, keepers of the old ways, protectors of the balance between worlds. For generations, we have stood watch over the threshold, keeping the shadows at bay." "What shadows?" "The ones that hunger for our world, that press against the barriers between dimensions. They whisper promises of power, of knowledge, of everything the human heart desires. But they lie, Anthony. They are parasites, feeding on life and light and hope." I set down my teacup, my hands shaking. "This is insane. You're talking about monsters, about magic." "Am I?" She gestured to the window, where the garden writhed in the moonlight. "Look with your true sight, Anthony. See what others cannot." And suddenly I could see. The garden wasn't just overgrown. It was alive, truly alive, with things that weren't quite plants and weren't quite animals. Shapes moved between the trees, pale and hungry and waiting. "The barriers have been weakening," Constance continued. "Without a proper guardian, without someone to maintain the old rituals, they've been seeping through. Your father tried to run from his responsibility, and look what happened. The shadows followed him, drove him mad, ultimately claimed him. What do you want from me?" "I want you to take my place, to become the new guardian, to learn the old ways before it's too late." She reached for my hand, her fingers cold as ice. "I'm dying, Anthony. I can feel the shadows gathering, waiting for the moment when I can no longer hold them back. If you don't accept your inheritance, if the guardian line is broken, they'll pour into our world like a flood." I pulled my hand away, standing up so quickly that my chair fell backward. "No, I'm not staying here. I'm not becoming some keeper of monsters." "You don't have a choice," she said sadly. "The blood calls to blood, Anthony. You can try to run as your father did, but they'll follow you. They'll drive you to madness and death, and then they'll find another way through. Then I'll take my chances." I started toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The house around me seemed to shift and change, corridors stretching and contracting, stairs leading nowhere. "The house won't let you leave," Constance said from behind me. "Not until you understand, not until you accept what you are." I spun around to face her, but she was gone. In her place stood something that wore her face, but wasn't her. Something with too many teeth and eyes like black holes in space. "Choose Anthony," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "Join us willingly, or be consumed by the shadows you've spent your life fleeing." The walls began to bleed, dark stains spreading across the wallpaper like living things. The portraits screamed silently from their frames, their painted eyes weeping tears of black blood. I ran, crashing through the house in blind panic, but every door I opened led to another room, another corridor, another nightmare. The shadows followed me, reaching with fingers like cold smoke, whispering promises and threats in languages that hurt to hear. Finally, I found myself in a room I didn't recognize, a vast library with shelves that stretched up into darkness. Ancient books lined the walls, their leather bindings cracked and bleeding. And in the center of the room, sitting at a massive desk, was my father. "Hello, Anthony," he said, looking up from the book he was reading. "I've been waiting for you, Dad," I whispered, "but you're dead. Death is just another threshold, son, another barrier between worlds." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, let me tell you about our family." With trembling legs, I sat down. He looked exactly as I remembered him from my childhood, tall and handsome, with dark hair and kind eyes. But there was something wrong with his reflection in the window behind him, something that moved independently of his body. "We are the Blackwoods," he began, "and we have a responsibility older than civilization. We are the guardians of the threshold, the keepers of the balance. Every generation, one of us must take up the burden, must stand watch against the shadows. I don't want this responsibility. Neither did your grandmother or her father before her. But want has nothing to do with it. The shadows are real, Anthony. They hunger for our world, for the light and warmth and life they've been denied. Without us, without the rituals and protections we maintain, they would devour everything. Then why did you leave? Why did you run?" His face twisted with pain. "Because I was weak, because I thought I could escape what I was born to be. But the shadows followed me, as they always do. They whispered to me in the night, showed me visions of power and freedom. They promised me I could be more than just a guardian. I could be a god. What happened? I listened. I made a bargain with them, traded my soul for a taste of their power. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough. They wanted more, always more. So I tried to end it the only way I could. The car accident. No accident. I drove into that river hoping to drown the voices, hoping to break the connection. But death didn't free me, Anthony. It only changed my prison." He leaned forward, his eyes desperate. "Don't make my mistakes. Don't let pride and fear drive you to the same fate. What am I supposed to do? Accept your heritage. Learn the old ways from Constance while you still can. Become the guardian our family needs." His image began to fade, becoming translucent. "The shadows are growing stronger, Anthony. Without a proper guardian, they'll tear through the barriers like paper. The world will burn. Dad, don't go. I love you, son. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you deserved, but you can be the guardian I never was." His voice was barely a whisper now. "Choose wisely. Choose bravely. Choose for all the lives that depend on you." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the library, with only the sound of pages turning in the wind that had no source. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty chair where my father had been. Eventually, I became aware of footsteps approaching. Constance appeared in the doorway, looking frail and human again. "He spoke to you," she said. "It wasn't a question. Is it true, all of it?" "Every word." She moved to the window, gazing out at the writhing garden. "I can feel them pressing against the barriers, Anthony. They know I'm dying, know that the line of guardians is about to break. They're gathering their strength for one final push. How do I stop them? By accepting your heritage, by learning the rituals, the protections, the ancient words that keep them at bay." She turned to face me, her eyes pleading. "I know it's not the life you wanted, Anthony, but it's the life you were born for." I thought of my father, of the pain in his eyes as he told me about his failures. I thought of my mother, of the fear in her voice when she spoke of the shadows. I thought of the innocent people in the world below, going about their lives unaware of the hungry darkness that waited beyond the threshold. What do I have to do? Relief flooded her face. First, you must perform the ritual of binding to tie yourself to the house and the land. Then you must learn the old protections, the words and signs that keep the shadows at bay. And finally, you must take up the watch that has been maintained for generations. Will I ever be able to leave? The house will always be your anchor, but you can travel when necessary. The shadows exist everywhere, Anthony. Sometimes the guardian must go to them, rather than wait for them to come to us. She led me deeper into the house, to a room I'd never seen before. It was circular, with walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the room stood an altar made of black stone, carved with intricate patterns that hurt to look at. "The ritual of binding," Constance explained, "will link your soul to the house, to the land, to the very threshold between worlds. Once it's done, you'll be able to see the shadows clearly, to understand their nature and their weaknesses. And if I refuse, then you'll go mad as your father did. The shadows will follow you wherever you go, whispering and tempting and slowly driving you insane. Eventually, you'll either join them or find a way to end your suffering." I stared at the altar, at the symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the candlelight. This was my choice: accept a life of guardianship, of constant vigilance against creatures of living darkness, or face a slow descent into madness. What happens to you after the ritual? My watch ends. My soul will finally be free to rest. She smiled sadly. I've been waiting for this moment for 60 years, Anthony. Waiting for someone to take my place, to lift the burden from my shoulders. I thought of my comfortable life in Portland, of my plans for the future, of the woman I'd hoped to marry someday. All of that would be gone, replaced by a responsibility I'd never asked for. But I also thought of the alternatives. My father's fate, madness, and death. The shadows breaking through, consuming everything I'd ever cared about. "I'll do it," I said. The ritual was unlike anything I could have imagined. As Constance chanted words in a language that predated human speech, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The house around me came alive, its pulse matching my heartbeat. I could feel the land beneath my feet, the ancient trees that had stood guard for centuries, the very air that separated our world from the realm of shadows. And I could see them now, the shadows that pressed against the barriers, hungry and desperate and endless. They were beautiful and terrible, creatures of pure darkness that had once been something else, something that had chosen to trade their light for power. "Welcome to your inheritance, Anthony," Constance whispered as the ritual reached its climax. "Welcome to the watch." The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. My senses expanded beyond anything human, allowing me to perceive layers of reality that had been hidden from me before. I could see the shimmer of the barriers between worlds, could hear the whispers of the shadows as they tested for weaknesses. But more than that, I could feel the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a mantle. The lives of everyone in the world below suddenly became my concern, my sacred trust. Constance aged visibly as the ritual concluded, her hair turning white, her skin becoming translucent. "The burden passes to you now," she said. "Guard it well, Anthony. Guard it with your life." "What about you?" My watches ended. She smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked peaceful. "I can rest now." She faded away like morning mist, leaving me alone in the circular room with only the whispers of the shadows for company. That was 3 years ago. I've learned much since then about the old ways, about the creatures that hunger for our world, about the delicate balance that keeps them at bay. The house has become my home, my fortress, my prison. I've faced temptations that would have broken lesser men, offers of power and knowledge that could reshape the world. I've stood against incursions from the shadow realm, fighting creatures that exist at the very edge of possibility. And I've learned that the burden of guardianship is not just about protecting the world from the shadows. It's about protecting the shadows from themselves. They were not always monsters. Once, they were like us, beings of light and hope who made a choice that cost them everything. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if I made the right choice. If I should have run, as my father did, and let someone else take up the burden. But then I remember the hunger in the shadows' eyes, the way they press against the barriers like starving animals. And I know that I couldn't live with myself if I abandoned my post. The watch continues. The shadows grow stronger each year, their whispers more seductive, their offers more tempting. But I hold the line as my grandmother did, as her father did before her. I am Anthony Blackwood, last guardian of the threshold, keeper of the balance between worlds. And I will stand watch until the day I can pass the burden to another, or until the shadows finally claim me. The house settles around me in the darkness, its ancient timbers creaking with secrets. Outside, the garden writhes with things that should not be, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear the sound of wings, vast, membranous wings that belong to creatures from the spaces between stars. But for now, the barriers hold. For now, the world sleeps safely, unaware of the horrors that wait just beyond the threshold of their perception. And I keep watch, as I always will, until the end of days. This happened back in December, about a week before Christmas. I'm a 32-year-old guy and a 9-year veteran of the Navy, currently using my GI Bill benefits to attend college in Colorado. Between school and work, I'm constantly busy, so I don't have much time to go out and socialize the traditional way. I have to rely pretty heavily on dating apps to meet people. I matched with this really attractive girl around my age on Tinder. We had some good conversations over several days, and then we scheduled our first date. We decided to meet at a bar restaurant that wasn't too far for either of us to drive, so it seemed perfect for a casual first meeting. She was very pretty in person, exactly like her photos, and we got along great during our conversation. I found out that she worked in a non-police role at the local police station, essentially as a receptionist. I also learned that she had a roommate who she said was out of town for the holidays, visiting family. She added that she absolutely hated being alone in her apartment because she had this crazy ex-boyfriend who had been stalking her recently. I was a little uneasy when she mentioned that, and I told her as much. She quickly reassured me, saying he was completely harmless, just annoying. So I kind of let my guard down and didn't think much more about it. We had a few more drinks and stayed at the restaurant for about another hour. At her suggestion, she said we should go back to her place afterward. I mean, I wasn't going to argue with that proposal. She was attractive, and the night was going really well. She then insisted on driving both of us to her place. I told her I was perfectly fine to drive myself, but she said no, that I'd been drinking, and she saw too many DUI cases at her job to feel comfortable with that. I understood what she was saying, but I'd only had 2 gin and tonics over several hours and felt completely fine. Again, she insisted pretty firmly. I thought it was a little weird, but I didn't really care enough to argue about it. We went to her house, and she walked up to the front door and just opened it without using any keys. She didn't unlock it because it was already unlocked, which I found very odd. If she really had a stalker ex-boyfriend, and her roommate was out of town, why would she leave her door unlocked? She started feeding her cat, and while she was doing that, I noticed a bowl of cereal sitting on the kitchen counter. I touched the bowl out of curiosity, and it was still cold, like it hadn't been sitting there for very long. The cereal wasn't soggy either. I could see clearly that it was Frosted Flakes, and the cereal hadn't even been in the milk long enough for the frosting to start dissolving. So I knew for certain it wasn't old. I asked her whose cereal it was, and she hesitated for several seconds before saying she'd eaten it as a quick snack before heading to the bar to meet me. It just didn't make any logical sense, and before I could say anything else or ask more questions, she just kissed me passionately and put her arms around me seductively. "Take me to my bedroom," she whispered. Again, she was pretty attractive, and I quit thinking about the mysterious cereal bowl. We started fooling around in her bedroom, and I went to close the curtains for privacy. She told me firmly to leave them open, which struck me as strange, but I didn't argue. A few minutes later, maybe 5 minutes at most, we were in bed together. As my back was toward the window, she suddenly let out this huge gasp, a genuinely terrified gasp. Her eyes were focused on something behind me at the window. I turned around quickly and saw someone in a dark hoodie standing there, watching us. They immediately took off running, and I could hear footsteps pounding across her back deck. I immediately jumped up and ran to make sure all her doors were locked. Of course, the front door wasn't secured. I ran to it and locked it properly, and right when I did, the door started getting banged on violently from the outside. I was about to open it because I was ready to beat the hell out of this guy, or at least try to. But she told me urgently to just come back to bed with her, like nothing unusual was happening. I screamed at her, asking if she was completely insane. She told me calmly that he does this kind of thing regularly, and usually just goes away if you ignore him. I asked her directly, "You know this is your ex-boyfriend, right?" she said. "Yeah, and don't worry about it. He's harmless." At this point, the banging started on a different side of the house, and she didn't seem scared at all. She kept trying to get me to come back to bed with her like this was totally normal behavior. I didn't want to call the police because for all I knew, this guy might be a cop himself, or she would know the officers who showed up, and they might take her side over mine. I also couldn't just leave because my car was still at the bar, and I felt completely trapped with very limited options. I had such an intense adrenaline rush that it gave me that metallic taste in my mouth, and my stomach hurt. I felt stuck with basically no good choices, and I didn't trust her at all at this point. I started calling her out about the unlocked door and the fresh cereal bowl. I openly called her a liar to her face. She couldn't come up with any logical explanation for any of it, and I had absolutely no idea what kind of situation I'd walked into. She kept telling me to calm down and insisted I should just go back to bed with her. The banging was moving around the house in a pattern. Her ex would bang on one part of the house, then it would stop, and then it would start up again at a completely different location. I probably shouldn't have done this, but my fight or flight response was fully activated. I told her, if this is some kind of robbery or setup, I promise you I will kill both of you. I'm not normally a tough guy or anything, but my fear made me want to let her know that whatever this was, they'd have a serious fight on their hands. I secretly ordered an Uber on my phone when she wasn't looking, and I didn't tell her about it. I just kept arguing with her and asking her what the hell was really going on, hoping to keep her talking and distracted until my ride arrived. I stayed right next to the door so I could leave immediately when the Uber showed up. Luckily, I'd never taken my pants completely off, and my jacket and shoes were right by the door, so I was able to get dressed quickly. The Uber arrived pretty fast, thankfully, but the banging was happening on the front part of the house, near the window, not even 10 feet from the door. Without saying anything to her, I just opened the door and ran out as fast as I could. I saw a person running around the side of the house as I sprinted to the car. I jumped in and looked back at the door. My date was just standing there in the doorway, watching me leave with this strange expression on her face. It's been a little over a month since that happened, and I honestly have no idea what the hell I walked into that night. I don't believe her story about it just being a girl with a crazy but harmless ex-boyfriend. Based on all the factors I told you about, it feels like it was either some kind of robbery setup, or some weird fetish thing, or even worse, a trap designed to hurt or kill someone. I'm very angry at myself for the whole situation. I mean, I'm a 9-year military veteran, and I allowed myself to get into a dangerous situation like that. I reported her account during the Uber ride back to the bar, and I told the bartender about what happened, just in case they ever saw her in there again. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.